The amber glow of sunset painted the main street of Silverbrush Crossing in hues of gold and crimson. Dust motes danced in the waning light as Abigail Thornton stood frozen on the steps of the Silverbrush Bank, a cream envelope clutched in her trembling hands. The world around her continued its steady rhythm, horses and wagons rattling past townspeople exchanging pleasantries. But for Abigail, time had stopped the moment she'd broken the bank's official seal. $5,000, due in 90 days. The sum echoed in her mind like a death knell. $5,000 might as well have been $5 million to a widow running a cattle ranch on her own, no matter how successful she'd made it these past 5 years since Edwin's passing. Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Caldwell, the bank manager, stood in the doorway behind her, his thin frame casting a long shadow across the weathered boards. "I truly am sorry. If there were anything I could do—" "You've done quite enough, Mr. Caldwell." Abigail's voice emerged steady despite the storm raging within her. She straightened her spine, smoothed her practical riding skirt, and turned to face him with the dignity that had become her armor since burying her husband. "Thank you for your consideration in delivering this news personally rather than sending it to the ranch." Caldwell's jowls quivered as he cleared his throat. "Your husband borrowed against the ranch to invest in the railroad coming through Baxter Canyon. He was certain it would make a fortune, but when they rerouted through Silverbrush instead, the investment became worthless." Abigail completed the sentence, the bitter taste of betrayal rising in her throat. Another secret, another lie. How many more were buried with Edwin? "Precisely." Caldwell tugged at his collar. "The bank has been patient, Mrs. Thornton, but the board of directors in Denver is insisting we resolve all outstanding debts from that period. 90 days. Abigail folded the notice with precise movements, tucking it into her reticule. "And if I cannot pay, then I'm afraid Thornton Ranch will be foreclosed upon and sold at auction to satisfy the debt." The words hung in the air between them, stark and unforgiving as the Montana winter that had nearly killed her during her first year out west. Abigail nodded once a queen, acknowledging a subject, then descended the steps with measured grace. Only when she was mounted on her chestnut mare and well beyond the town limits did she allow the tears to fall hot and furious against her cheeks. The Thornton Ranch spread across 5,000 acres of the most fertile grazing land in the territory. Rolling hills dotted with Hereford cattle gave way to stands of pine and aspen, their leaves beginning to turn with the approach of autumn. A creek, Silver Creek, wound its way through the property like a ribbon of liquid mercury in the fading light. This land, this legacy, was all Abigail had left, and now it too was being torn from her grasp. She slowed her mare to a walk as she approached the main house, a substantial 2-story structure built of local timber and stone. Edwin had designed it himself, insisting on the wraparound porch and tall windows that reminded Abigail of her family home in Boston. It had been his gift to her, his way of easing her transition from society belle to frontier wife. Boston seemed a lifetime ago now. The elegant debutante who had scandalized her family by marrying a Western businessman with grand ambitions had been replaced by a woman who could birth a calf mend fences and haggle with cattle buyers without breaking a sweat. "You're home early, Mrs. Thornton." Frank Hudson, her ranch foreman, stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. At 60, Frank was as much a fixture of the ranch as the house itself, having worked for Edwin's father before Edwin inherited the place. His weathered face, tanned from decades under the Montana sun, creased with concern as he took in her expression. "Bad news in town." Abigail dismounted, handing the reins to a waiting stable boy. "The worst kind, Frank. We need to talk." Inside her study, once Edwin's domain, but now transformed with her practical touch, Abigail poured 2 glasses of whiskey, something she never would have done in her Boston days. She handed one to Frank, who accepted it with raised eyebrows. "That bad, is it?" Edwin took out a loan against the ranch, $5,000 to invest in the Baxter Canyon Railroad. Abigail took a bracing sip, welcoming the burn. "The bank wants repayment in 90 days. Frank's ruddy complexion paled. "5,000, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph." "Quite." Abigail settled into the leather chair behind her desk, her fingers tracing the worn edges where Edwin had once sat making decisions that affected their lives without ever consulting her. "I've gone through our accounts. Even if we sell the yearlings early and I use every penny of our savings, We'd still be short by half. Frank downed his whiskey in one gulp, his expression grim. And that'd leave us with nothing to get through winter. The magnitude of Edwin's betrayal settled over Abigail like a shroud. She'd married him against her parents' wishes, believing in his vision of a life built together on the frontier. She'd left behind the comforts of Boston society for love, or what she'd thought was love. Now she wondered if she'd ever truly known her husband at all. "There are options," Frank said after a long silence. "Judge Sullivan's been making his interest plain since your mourning period ended. Man like that could settle 5,000 without blinking. I'll sell this ranch piece by piece before I sell myself to Walter Sullivan." Abigail's voice cut like steel. "Besides, the judge is not interested in me, Frank. He's interested in the water rights that come with Thornton land." Frank nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Never thought you'd consider it anyway. Just laying out all the cards." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "We could increase the herd, maybe get a bank loan of our own to tide us over until spring roundup." "No more loans," Abigail shook her head firmly. "I won't compound Edwin's mistakes with more debt." They discussed alternatives well into the evening, selling off parcels of land, approaching the Cattle Buyers Association for an advance, even writing to Abigail's estranged family in Boston, though she dismissed that option almost immediately. Pride had kept her from informing them of Edwin's death 5 years ago. She certainly wouldn't go crawling back now with her hand outstretched. By the time Frank took his leave, the only certainty was that there were no easy answers. Abigail sat alone in her study, watching shadows lengthen across the room as twilight deepened into night. She pulled out the worn leather ledger where she'd meticulously recorded every expenditure and profit since taking over the ranch. The columns of numbers, once a source of pride, now seemed to mock her. A soft knock at the door roused her from her dark thoughts. "Come in." Anna, the housekeeper who'd been with them since Abigail first arrived as a bride, entered with a tray of tea. "Thought you might need something stronger than whiskey for your nerves, ma'am." "Thank you, Anna." Abigail managed a small smile touched by the woman's thoughtfulness. "Has everyone heard already? News travels fast when it's bad." Anna poured the tea with practiced hands. "The men are worried, but they're loyal. They'll stand by you." Loyalty, it was a currency Abigail valued far more than gold these days. "I won't let them down, Anna. Somehow we'll find a way through this." After Anna left, Abigail found herself drawn to the bookshelves that lined one wall of the study. Among the practical volumes on cattle breeding and land management sat a collection of leather-bound journals, Edwin's private records, which she'd never had the heart to read after his death. Now driven by a need to understand the man who had left her in such a precarious position, she pulled one down and began to flip through the pages. Edwin's handwriting, bold and slanting, filled the pages with observations about the ranch business dealings and occasional personal reflections. Most entries were mundane, but a passage from 3 years before his death caught her eye. "Met with Dr. Harrington again today. The guilt grows heavier each year, but he assures me the money is being well invested for when he locates the Reed family. 10 years since that terrible night, and still no peace." Abigail frowned, reading the passage twice more. Harrington Reed family. Edwin had never mentioned either to her. The entry raised more questions than it answered, but it did explain the mysterious payments she'd found in the old account books, regular sums sent to a Dr. J. Harrington in Topeka, Kansas. Had Edwin been ill? Was that why he'd hidden the railroad investment from her, knowing he wouldn't live to see its failure? But that didn't explain the reference to the Reed family, or the guilt that apparently plagued him. Another mystery and another secret taken to the grave. Abigail closed the journal with a sigh, her mind too exhausted to puzzle through it further tonight. Whatever Edwin had been hiding, it would have to wait. The immediate concern was saving the ranch, her home, her legacy, and the livelihood of everyone who depended on her. As she prepared for bed, Abigail caught sight of her reflection in the dressing table mirror. At 45, she was still a handsome woman, her dark hair now streaked with silver at the temples, her blue eyes clear and direct. The soft debutante had been replaced by a woman weathered by frontier life and widowhood, her face bearing fine lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. Not for the first time, she wondered what her life might have been if she'd made different choices. If she'd heeded her father's warnings about Edwin Thornton's character. If she'd married Daniel Clayton instead, her childhood friend who'd followed her west only to watch her pledge herself to another man. But regrets were luxuries she couldn't afford. Not now, not with everything she'd built threatened by Edwin's final betrayal. Tomorrow she would begin the fight to save Thornton Ranch. Tonight she would permit herself this one moment of grief for the life she'd thought she was building and the husband she'd never truly known. Sheriff Daniel Clayton noticed the stranger the moment he stepped off the eastbound stagecoach. In a town the size of Silverbrush Crossing, new faces were rare enough to warrant attention, but this man would have stood out in a crowd of thousands. He towered over the other passengers, his frame an impressive 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle beneath a travel-worn coat. Dark hair too long by town standards curled at his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a face that might have been handsome, if not for the wariness in his eyes, the look of a man who expected trouble around every corner. Daniel watched from the doorway of his office as the stranger collected a single battered satchel and surveyed the town with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether to stay or move on. Something about the man's bearing, the straight spine, the squared shoulders suggested military training, but the way he kept to the shadows spoke of someone accustomed to avoiding notice. Interesting combination. New arrival. Deputy Tom Wilson appeared at Daniel's elbow, chewing on a toothpick. Just got off the billing stage. Daniel kept his voice neutral, though his instincts were already humming. 20 years as a lawman had taught him to trust those instincts. Keep an eye on him, but don't make it obvious. I want to know where he goes, who he talks to. You thinking trouble, Sheriff? Daniel considered the question. Not necessarily, but men that size who try to make themselves small, they're either running from something or hiding something. Either way, it's worth knowing which. The stranger made his way to the Silverbrush Hotel, the most modest of the town's 3 establishments. Daniel noted the choice not the cheapest option, which might attract attention from those looking for an easy mark, but not expensive enough to be memorable either. The middle path, the invisible path, definitely a man who knew how to disappear. Daniel returned to his desk, trying to focus on the stack of wanted posters that had arrived on yesterday's mail coach. But his mind kept drifting to Abigail and their brief tense encounter outside the bank earlier that day. He'd been making his rounds when he spotted her emerging, her face pale with shock despite her composed demeanor. He'd known better than to approach her directly. Their relationship had been complicated since her marriage to Edwin Cordial, but distant, weighted with unspoken regrets and paths not taken. Still, he'd made a point of asking Caldwell what had transpired, only to be stonewalled with banking confidentiality. Whatever had happened, it had shaken Abigail badly. And despite everything, the years of watching her build a life with another man, the pain of standing at Edwin's graveside, seeing her grief for a husband who'd never deserved her, Daniel still cared. Too much. He was contemplating a ride out to Thornton Ranch on some pretense when the door to his office swung open and Judge Walter Sullivan strode in resplendent in a tailored suit that stretched tight across his ample midsection. Clayton. Sullivan nodded brusquely, helping himself to the chair across from Daniel's desk without invitation. At 65, the judge carried himself with the entitled air of a man accustomed to deference. His silver hair and neatly trimmed mustache gave him a distinguished appearance that belied his calculating nature. I understand Mrs. Thornton received some troubling news today. Of course he knew already. Sullivan didn't just dispense justice in Silverbrush Crossing. He collected information like a magpie collected shiny objects, storing away every secret and scandal for future use. I wouldn't know, Your Honor. Daniel kept his tone professional despite his dislike for the man. Mrs. Thornton's business is her own. Sullivan's smile didn't reach his pale blue eyes. Come now, Sheriff. We both know Edwin Thornton left that poor woman in dire financial straits. The railroad investment was the final nail in a coffin he'd been building for years with his reckless speculation. As I said, Judge Mrs. Thornton's affairs are her own concern. Daniel leaned back in his chair, regarding Sullivan coolly. Was there something official you needed from me today? Sullivan's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into practiced affability. Actually, yes. There's a new arrival in town I'd like you to keep an eye on. Tall fellow came in on the afternoon stage. My sources in Billings say he's been asking questions about work in these parts. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Looking for work hardly seems cause for suspicion. Perhaps not. Sullivan adjusted his gold cufflinks in ostentatious display for a frontier town judge. But men don't usually travel this far west unless they're looking for opportunity or running from trouble. I prefer to know which before they settle in our community. Our community, as if Sullivan owned the town and everyone in it. I'll keep an eye out, Daniel conceded, as I would for any new arrival. Sullivan rose, straightening his vest over his substantial girth. Excellent. Oh, and Clayton, when you see Mrs. Thornton, do convey my sincere condolences regarding her financial difficulties. She should know that my offer of assistance stands, should she be willing to entertain it. The implication hung in the air like the stench of rotten meat. Sullivan had been circling Abigail since Edwin's death, his courtship thinly veiling his true interest in the water rights that came with Thornton land rights that would make him the most powerful man in the territory if the railroad decided to establish a major hub in Silverbrush Crossing. I'll be sure to pass that along if our paths cross, Daniel replied evenly, though his jaw clenched at the thought of Sullivan anywhere near Abigail. After the judge departed, Daniel found himself staring at the calendar on his wall marking 5 years since Edwin Thornton's sudden death from heart failure. 5 years of watching Abigail transform from a grieving widow into a formidable rancher who commanded respect throughout the territory. 5 years of tamping down feelings that had no right to exist. He'd loved Abigail since they were children in Boston, had followed her west when she married Edwin, telling himself he merely wanted adventure and opportunity. The lie had sustained him through years of witnessing their marriage, through standing as Edwin's friend while silently cataloging all the ways the man failed to appreciate the treasure he had won. Daniel had maintained his distance during Abigail's widowhood, respecting her grief and independence. But lately he'd begun to hope that perhaps given time, he shook his head, dismissing the thought. Abigail had made it clear she had no interest in remarrying to him or anyone else. Her focus was the ranch, and preserving Edwin's legacy, a loyalty Daniel found both admirable and frustrating, given what he knew of Edwin's character. Now with financial troubles threatening everything she'd built, Daniel feared Sullivan would press his advantage. The judge had a reputation for acquiring what he wanted by any means necessary, whether through legal channels or more insidious methods. Daniel wouldn't allow Sullivan to use Abigail's vulnerability against her. Somehow he would find a way to help her without wounding her pride or overstepping the careful boundaries they'd established. But first he needed to learn more about their mysterious new arrival. Something told him their paths would cross again soon, and Daniel Clayton preferred to be prepared when they did. Mason Reed sat on the edge of the narrow bed in his hotel room, turning his mother's worn Bible over in his hands. The leather binding was cracked with age, and used the pages dog-eared and marked with her neat notations in the margins. It was all he had left of her now, this book, and the small wooden box containing her wedding ring and a lock of her hair. 2 weeks since he'd laid her to rest beside his father's empty grave in the Kansas soil. 2 weeks of drifting westward, putting distance between himself and the memories, the guilt, the ghosts that seemed to be his every step. Silverbrush Crossing hadn't been a deliberate destination. He'd simply boarded the stage in Billings when he'd run low on funds, reasoning that a growing town might offer work for a man with his skills. Now staring at the bare walls of the hotel room, Mason wondered if he should have kept moving. There was something about this place that felt both welcoming and dangerous, like the calm before a storm. He'd noticed the sheriff watching him arrive, a tall man with shrewd eyes and a careful way of holding himself that spoke of both authority and restraint. Mason had felt the weight of that gaze like a physical touch and had instinctively made himself smaller, less noticeable, a habit ingrained from 8 years of avoiding attention, 8 years of running, 8 years of never staying long enough to form attachments or invite questions, 8 years of punishment for a desperate act that had ultimately changed nothing. His mother had died anyway 3 days after he'd broken into Dr. Harrington's clinic to steal medicine for her worsening fever. 3 days after he'd accidentally injured the doctor when the man caught him in the act. 3 days of hoping, praying, believing that his sacrifice's crime would save her. It hadn't. Mason closed the Bible and tucked it carefully into his satchel alongside the wooden box. Tomorrow he would look for work, something that would keep him outdoors and away from too many curious eyes. He'd heard the ranches in this area were always short-handed, especially with autumn approaching and cattle needing to be moved to lower pastures before the first snows. He'd work hard, keep to himself, earn enough to move on before winter set in. That was the pattern, the rhythm of his existence since that night in Topeka. Never settle, never connect, never stop moving. It was a lonely life, but it was the only one available to a man with his past. As Mason stretched out on the bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, he found himself thinking of his mother's favorite saying, Some people are born knowing exactly who they're meant to be, but others need to be loved into becoming themselves. He wondered not for the first time which kind of person he was, and whether after everything he would ever have the chance to find out. The morning brought no solutions to Abigail's financial crisis, but it did bring the clarity that came with decisive action. After a sleepless night reviewing her options, she'd formed a plan, not a good one perhaps, but the only one available that didn't involve begging for help or selling her soul to Walter Sullivan. She would sell off the southeast pasture prime grazing land, but separable from the main ranch without disrupting operations too severely. It wouldn't cover the entire debt, but it would buy her time to find the rest. The decision felt like cutting off a limb to save the body, but Abigail had learned long ago that survival sometimes required sacrifice. Dressed in her riding clothes, hair neatly pinned beneath a practical hat, she rode into town with Frank to meet with Caldwell and discuss terms. The early morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and Abigail drew it deep into her lungs, using the familiar scent of pine and prairie grass to steel her resolve. Silverbrush Crossing was already bustling despite the hour. Wagons lined the main street, merchants arranged displays outside their shops, and the blacksmith's forge glowed orange against the shadowed interior of his workshop. Abigail nodded greetings to acquaintances as she passed, maintaining the composed demeanor that had become her trademark. No one would know from looking at her that her world was crumbling beneath her feet. That was something else. The frontier had taught her the value of a strong facade when everything behind it threatened to collapse. As they approached the bank, Abigail spotted a commotion outside the general store across the street. A crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an overturned wagon, its contents spilled across the dusty road. But it was the man at the center of the chaos who caught her attention, the tallest man she'd ever seen. His broad shoulders straining against his shirt as he single-handedly lifted the wagon's corner, allowing others to pull a trapped boy free. "Would you look at that?" Frank murmured beside her. "Fellows strong as an ox." The stranger set the wagon down with surprising gentleness. Once the boy was safe, then stepped back from the grateful parents' effusive thanks, his expression uncomfortable with the attention. Something about his demeanor, the way he tried to make himself inconspicuous despite his size, struck Abigail as both odd and strangely touching. "He's new in town," she observed. "Came in on yesterday's stage according to Millie at the hotel." Frank's network of information never ceased to amaze her. "Name's Mason Reed, looking for work, apparently." Abigail watched as Mason extricated himself from the crowd's gratitude, moving with the careful precision of a man accustomed to navigating a world built for smaller people. There was a grace to him that belied his eye, and when he glanced in her direction, she caught a glimpse of dark eyes filled with an emotion she recognized all too well. Grief, raw and recent. She looked away quickly, disturbed by the unexpected connection. "We should get to our appointment." The meeting with Caldwell went about as well as expected. He was sympathetic but firm. The bank would accept the southeast pasture as partial payment, reducing the debt to a more manageable $2,000, but the remaining sum would still be due within the original 90-day time frame. "It's the best I can do, Mrs. Thornton," Caldwell said apologetically. "The board in Denver is quite insistent." "I understand." Abigail signed the preliminary agreement with a steady hand, ignoring the sick feeling in her stomach. $2,000 was still an impossible sum to raise in 90 days without selling off more land or livestock they couldn't afford to lose. "The survey team can begin work on Monday." As they left the bank, Abigail felt the weight of Frank's concern like a physical presence. "We'll find a way," she assured him. The words rang hollow even to her own ears. "Perhaps the cattle prices will improve at the autumn auctions." "Perhaps." Frank didn't sound convinced. "I'd best get back to the ranch. Johnson's bringing in that new stallion today, and I want to make sure the corral is secure. That beast has a reputation." "I'll join you shortly. I need to stop by the mercantile for supplies." After Frank departed, Abigail made her way to the general store, forcing herself to focus on practical matters rather than the looming financial disaster. She was examining a bolt of heavy wool fabric for winter repairs when a deep voice spoke from beside her. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Mr. Owens said I might find the ranch owners in town today. I'm looking for work." Abigail turned to find Mason Reed standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. Up close, he was even more imposing, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to cast a shadow over her. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark and haunted beneath the polite inquiry. Mr. Reed, is it? She kept her tone businesslike. I saw your assistance with the wagon earlier. Impressive strength. A flush crept up his neck, visible even through his tan. Just happened to be nearby, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same. I doubt anyone else could have lifted that wagon single-handed. Abigail studied him with the assessing gaze she used for new ranch hands. His clothes were worn but clean, his posture straight despite his obvious attempt to appear less intimidating by hunching slightly. Everything about him spoke of a man who took pride in his work, but not necessarily in himself. What kind of experience do you have? Bit of everything, ma'am. Worked at cattle ranches in Kansas and Nebraska, did some logging in Colorado. Good with horses, breaking and training. Can mend most anything that's broken. He hesitated, then added quietly, I don't drink or gamble, and I'm not looking for trouble. Just honest work. There was something in the way he said it, a earnestness coupled with resignation, as if he expected rejection despite his qualifications. Abigail found herself intrigued despite her usual caution with new hires. My foreman mentioned we might need an extra hand for the autumn roundup, she said, making a quick decision. With the financial pressure mounting, she couldn't afford to turn away capable help, especially someone who claimed skill with horses. The new stallion had been a significant investment one she'd made before learning of Edwin's hidden debt. If Reed could help make that investment pay off through breeding fees. Thornton Ranch, 5 miles east of town. Ask for Frank Hudson. Tell him I sent you. Relief flickered across Mason's face, quickly masked by a nod of acknowledgement. Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Reed. Frank runs a tight operation and autumn work is demanding. You'll earn every dollar. Yes, ma'am. That's all I ask, a chance to prove my worth. Something about the phrase struck Abigail as peculiar, hinting at deeper currents beneath the simple request for employment. But she had more pressing concerns than the history of a drifter seeking work. Report tomorrow at dawn, she said, returning her attention to the fabric. And Mr. Reed, the stallion arriving today has a temperament to match his bloodlines. If you're as good with horses as you claim, you'll have ample opportunity to demonstrate it. She felt his gaze linger on her profile for a moment longer than strictly proper, an assessment that matched her own earlier scrutiny. Then he settled his hat back on his head with a murmured, yes, ma'am, and departed, his footsteps surprisingly light for a man of his size. Abigail watched him go, an inexplicable sense of something momentous having occurred, settling over her. Ridiculous, of course. She'd merely hired a ranch hand, something she'd done dozens of times since taking over the operation after Edwin's death. Yet something about Mason Reed nagged at her thoughts as she completed her errands and mounted her mare for the ride home. Perhaps it was the grief she'd glimpsed in his eyes, a mirror of her own carefully concealed pain. Or perhaps it was simply that in a town where everyone knew her business and viewed her through the lens of her relationship to Edwin Reed, had looked at her and seen only the woman she was now, direct, capable, in command. Either way, she had more important matters to consider than the impression made by a drifting cowboy. The future of Thornton Ranch hung in the balance, and no amount of new help would change the fundamental equation, $2,000 in 90 days, or everything she'd built would crumble to dust. The new stallion was indeed everything the broker had promised, 17 hands of gleaming black muscle, with a bloodline tracing back to some of the finest Arabian stock in the country. He was also, as Abigail discovered upon arriving home, utterly unmanageable. Damn near killed Johnson getting him off the wagon, Frank reported grimly. Took 3 men to get him into the corral, and he's already broken through the inner fence once. Had to secure him in the reinforced stall, and even that's barely holding him. Abigail watched the magnificent animal pacing his confines, nostrils flared and eyes rolling with barely contained fury. The stallion, pretentiously named Midnight Emperor by his previous owner, represented a significant investment, one she'd made with the intention of improving their breeding stock and generating income through stud fees. Now, with the bank debt looming, she couldn't afford for this venture to fail. But a stallion that couldn't be handled was worthless, no matter how impressive his pedigree. What does Miller say? She asked, referring to their current horse trainer. Frank's expression said it all. Miller took one look and said he's too old to break his neck over a devil horse. Suggested we sell him for whatever we can get and cut our losses. Abigail pressed her lips into a thin line. That's not an option. We've invested too much, and we need the breeding fees now more than ever. She continued watching the stallion, noting the way he moved, powerful but precise, every motion controlled despite his apparent rage. He's not actually crazy, Frank. He's terrified. Makes him no less dangerous. True. Abigail sighed, removing her gloves. But it does make him potentially manageable by the right person. Let's see if our new hire is as good with horses as he claims. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect autumn day that made the harshness of frontier life seem worthwhile. Abigail was already reviewing accounts in her study when she heard the distinctive sound of hoofbeats approaching the main house. A single rider arriving exactly at dawn as instructed. Punctuality, a promising start. She watched from the window as Mason Reed dismounted with fluid grace, patting the neck of his own mount, a sturdy bay gelding that looked like it had carried him many miles. Frank emerged from the bunkhouse to greet him, and Abigail observed their interaction with interest. Frank wasn't easily impressed, particularly by drifters, but something in his body language suggested a tentative approval as he showed Reed toward the stables. Returning to her accounts, Abigail tried to focus on the columns of figures that might somehow reveal a solution to their financial predicament. But her mind kept drifting to Edwin's journal and the mysterious Dr. Harrington in Kansas. What guilt had Edwin been carrying? What connection did he have to the Reed family mentioned in his writings? The coincidence of hiring a man named Reed right after discovering these references wasn't lost on her, but Mason Reed was hardly an uncommon name. Still, the possibility of some connection nagged at her, a loose thread she couldn't help wanting to pull. Later that morning, having made no progress with the accounts, Abigail decided to inspect the new stallion and incidentally observe Reed's first day of work. She found most of the ranch hands gathered at a careful distance from the corral, watching with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright amusement as Mason approached the stall containing Midnight Emperor. The stallion's reputation had clearly spread, and the men were expecting entertainment at the new hire's expense. "Gentleman's betting pool says he doesn't last 5 minutes," Johnson muttered as Abigail joined them. "Beast nearly took my arm off yesterday." Abigail ignored the comment, her attention fixed on Mason as he stood outside the stall, making no move to enter. For nearly 10 minutes, he simply observed the agitated stallion, his expression thoughtful rather than intimidated. Then, to everyone's surprise, he pulled a small carved whistle from his pocket and began to play a low, soothing melody that carried across the stable yard. The stallion's ears pricked forward, his pacing slowing as the unusual sound captured his attention. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank murmured beside her. "Never seen anything like it." Mason continued playing the simple tune, repeated with slight variations until the stallion stopped pacing entirely and stood with his head extended toward the source of the music. Only then did Mason pocket the whistle and begin speaking too softly for the observers to hear the words, but the deep rumble of his voice seemed to have the same hypnotic effect on the animal. After another 5 minutes of this one-sided conversation, Mason slowly opened the stall door just enough to slip inside. The assembled ranch hands collectively held their breath, expecting violence to erupt at any moment. Instead, they witnessed something extraordinary. The stallion, while still clearly wary, allowed Mason to approach within arm's length without striking out. Mason made no attempt to touch the animal or assert dominance. He simply existed in the same space, his posture relaxed, but alert, his voice a constant, gentle murmur. "He's speaking to that horse like it's a person," Johnson said, incredulous. "Like it understands every word." "Maybe it does," Abigail replied, softly, mesmerized by the tableau. There was something almost intimate about the scene, a communion between two powerful beings, each wary of the other, but gradually establishing trust. It reminded her oddly of her early days with Edwin, when she'd been as wild and frightened as that stallion, thrust into a world she didn't understand, and he had patiently coaxed her into accepting her new life. The comparison made her uncomfortable, carrying implications she wasn't ready to examine. After nearly half an hour, Mason did something that drew gasps from the onlookers. He turned his back on the stallion, a move that should have invited attack from an animal as volatile as Midnight Emperor. Instead, the horse merely watched, nostrils flaring, as he scented the man who had invaded his territory without threat or aggression. When Mason finally emerged from the stall, closing the door quietly behind him, the stallion remained calm, watching him with what almost appeared to be curiosity rather than fear or rage. "That's enough for today," Mason said, his deep voice carrying to where Abigail stood. "He needs time to think about things. I'll come back this evening, let him get used to my scent and voice before I try touching him. Frank stepped forward, his expression a mixture of amazement and professional assessment. Never seen a man gentle a horse that way. Where'd you learn that trick with the whistle? A shadow passed over Mason's features, quickly suppressed. My mother taught me. She had a way with animals. Said music speaks to the part of them that remembers being wild and free before men tried to own them. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Abigail said, approaching the two men. Mason glanced up, clearly startled to find her among the observers. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair in need of a trim. She was Mrs. Thornton. The past tense didn't escape Abigail's notice. She passed 2 weeks ago. Influenza. The words were simple, factual, but the grief behind them was palpable. That's why I came west. Needed a change. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Reed. Abigail's condolence was genuine, the familiar ache of her own grief resonating with his obvious pain. It's never easy losing someone you love. Something flickered in Mason's dark eyes, recognition perhaps of a shared experience. No, ma'am, it isn't. The moment stretched between them, a fragile connection neither had anticipated. Then Frank cleared his throat, breaking the spell. Well, Reed, if you can get that demon horse manageable, you'll have earned your wages twice over. For now, though, we've got fence repairs on the north pasture that won't fix themselves. Yes, sir. Mason settled his hat back on his head, nodded respectfully to Abigail, and followed Frank toward the equipment shed. Abigail remained by the corral, watching the stallion that had already destroyed the reputations of two experienced trainers. The animal seemed calmer now, his powerful body no longer vibrating with tension. Whatever Mason had done in that brief encounter had reached something fundamental in the horse's nature. She found herself wondering what other hidden talents the quiet giant might possess, and what secrets lay beneath his carefully controlled exterior. The grief she'd glimpsed was real, but there was something else there too, a wariness that went beyond the natural caution of a newcomer. Mason Reed was running from something. The realization came to her with unexpected clarity. Not just seeking work or a fresh start after his mother's death, but actively fleeing some aspect of his past. Abigail knew she should be concerned, perhaps even suspicious. A man with secrets could bring trouble to her already precarious situation. The sensible course would be to keep her distance to maintain the clear boundary between employer and employee. Yet she couldn't deny the strange sense of kinship she'd felt in that brief exchange about loss. For 5 years, she'd carried her grief like a private burden, never allowing others to see beneath her capable exterior. In Mason's eyes, she'd recognized a similar solitude, the isolation of someone accustomed to bearing pain alone. It was this recognition, more than his skill with horses or impressive strength, that lingered in her thoughts as she returned to the house and her endless calculations. $2,000 in 90 days. An impossible sum for a ranch already operating on narrow margins. But as she stared at the numbers, Abigail found herself thinking of the stallion considered unmanageable until someone approached him with patience and understanding instead of force. Perhaps her financial predicament, like Midnight Emperor, simply required a different perspective, a solution that came from working with its nature rather than against it. The question was whether she could find that solution before time ran out, and whether the mysterious Mason Reed would prove to be an asset to Thornton Ranch or another complication she could ill afford. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as autumn tightened its grip on the Montana landscape. Mason proved himself a diligent worker, tackling every task assigned to him with quiet competence. But it was his progress with Midnight Emperor that truly set him apart. Each morning and evening, he spent time with the stallion, gradually building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than dominance. By the end of the first week, he could touch the horse's neck in withers without triggering aggression. By the end of the second, he had managed to place a halter on the animal and lead him in circles around the corral. Never seen anything like it, Frank admitted to Abigail as they watched Mason work with the stallion one evening. Most men would have resorted to ropes and restraints by now, tried to break his spirit. Reed's doing something different, like he's asking the horse to cooperate instead of demanding it. Abigail nodded, equally impressed. Has he shared anything more about himself, where he came from his previous work? Frank shook his head. Man's as closed as a clam about his past. Does his work, eats his meals, spends his free time either with that horse or reading his Bible. Doesn't drink with the other hands, doesn't join in the card games. He paused, considering. Not in an unfriendly way, mind you, just separates somehow, like he's passing through rather than settling in. The description matched Abigail's own observations. During her daily inspections of the ranch operations, she'd noted Mason's solitary nature. He was unfailingly polite when addressed, but never initiated conversation, and there was a guardedness about him that discouraged casual inquiry. Yet he wasn't unfriendly or antisocial. She'd seen him help the younger hands with difficult tasks, sharing his strength and skill without condescension. She'd observed his gentle patience with the new colts, his respectful handling of the pregnant mares. There was a fundamental decency to the man that shone through his reserve, making his reluctance to share his past all the more intriguing. I rode past that old cabin on the eastern boundary yesterday, Abigail said, following a sudden impulse. The one Johnson used before he moved into town with his wife. It's still solid, just needs some attention. Frank raised an eyebrow, immediately understanding her direction. You thinking of offering it to Reedman's? Only been here 2 weeks. And in that time, he's accomplished more with that stallion than our previous trainer did in 2 months. Abigail watched as Mason removed the halter from Midnight Emperor, rewarding the stallion's cooperation with a stroke along his powerful neck. Besides, the bunkhouse is crowded with the extra hands for autumn roundup. It would make sense to give our horse trainer some space of his own, especially if we want him to stay through winter. If you say so, ma'am. Frank's tone suggested he understood there was more to her decision than practical considerations, but he was too loyal to question her judgment. I'll let him know the cabin's available if he wants to fix it up. Thank you, Frank. Abigail turned away from the corral, but not before catching Mason's gaze across the distance, a brief connection that sent an unexpected warmth through her, despite the cooling evening air. And Frank, tell Mr. Reed he's welcome to use any salvaged materials from the storage shed for repairs. No need to ride into town for supplies. It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one on a ranch where every resource was carefully allocated. Frank nodded, understanding the significance. Yes, ma'am, I'm sure he'll appreciate that. Later that evening, as twilight settled over the land, Abigail found herself drawn to her favorite thinking spot, a bend in Silver Creek that curved through Thornton property about a half-mile from the main house. A massive cottonwood tree had fallen there years ago, creating a natural bench overlooking the water. Edwin had once promised to build her a proper gazebo on the spot, but like many of his promises, it had never materialized. Still, Abigail had come to love the simplicity of the place, the whisper of water over stones, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, the way the setting sun painted the ripples in shades of gold and crimson. Here, away from the constant demands of the ranch, she could think clearly, could remember who she was beneath the mantle of responsibility she wore so carefully. Tonight, she needed that clarity desperately. The bank had confirmed acceptance of the southeast pasture as partial payment, but $2,000 still loomed like an impossible mountain. The cattle auction was still weeks away, and even with favorable prices, it wouldn't generate enough cash. She'd written to several potential investors about purchasing breeding rights to Midnight Emperor, but without proof the stallion could be handled safely, those inquiries had gone unanswered. She was running out of options and time. Lost in these troubling thoughts, Abigail almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps, soft and tentative, as if the person was considering turning back. She glanced up to see Mason Reed standing at the edge of the clearing, a wooden box clutched in his large hands, and surprise written across his features. Mrs. Thornton, he immediately began to retreat. Forgive me for disturbing you. I didn't realize anyone would be here. No disturbance, Mr. Reed. Abigail found herself oddly relieved by his presence, a welcome interruption to her circular worries. Silver Creek is lovely at sunset. I often come here to think. Mason hesitated, clearly torn between politeness and a desire for solitude. I can come back another time. Please stay. The invitation surprised them both. The creek belongs to no one despite property lines. We can share it. After a moment's consideration, Mason nodded and approached, though he maintained a respectful distance, settling on a fallen log several feet from her position. The wooden box remained in his hands, his fingers tracing its edges with a tenderness that suggested it contained something precious. Frank mentioned the cabin is available, he said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. It's very generous of you, ma'am. It's practical, Abigail corrected, though they both recognized the explanation as partial at best. You've made exceptional progress with Midnight Emperor. I'd like you to continue that work through winter, prepare him for breeding season in the spring. The cabin would give you the privacy to focus on that task. Mason nodded, accepting her framing of the offer. I'll start repairs tomorrow after my regular duties. Should have it habitable within a week or so. Take whatever materials you need. That cabin was built solid. It's mainly the roof and porch that need attention. Another silence fell, this one filled with unspoken questions. Abigail found herself studying Mason's profile in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw beneath the neatly trimmed beard, the straight nose, the eyes that seemed to hold more sorrow than a man his age should know. There was a nobility to his features, a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with birth or status, and everything to do with character. "May I ask what brings you to Silver Creek this evening, Mr. Reed?" she finally inquired, nodding toward the box in his hands. "You seem to have a purpose beyond admiring the sunset." A shadow crossed his face, quickly suppressed. "Today would have been my mother's birthday. I wanted somewhere quiet to remember her." He glanced down at the box. This was hers. It contains her Bible and a few keepsakes. "I thought it seemed right to bring it here to say a few words where the water flows clean and the sky opens wide. She would have loved this spot." The simple explanation, delivered without dramatics, but with evident emotion, touched something in Abigail. She'd performed similar rituals after Edwin's death, finding private moments to honor his memory away from the public performance of widowhood. "What was she like, your mother?" The question emerged unbidden, personal, in a way that crossed the careful boundaries she maintained with her employees. Mason seemed surprised by her interest, but not displeased. "Her name was Sarah, Sarah Reed. She was the strongest person I've ever known, though you wouldn't think it to look at her. Small woman, barely came up to my shoulder once I was grown. But she had this way about her, could calm a frightened horse with just her voice, could make a feast from whatever scraps we had, could find beauty in the hardest circumstances." As he spoke, his deep voice softened with memory, and Abigail found herself drawn into his description, a portrait of a remarkable woman painted with love and admiration. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Mason opened the box carefully, revealing a worn leather Bible and a small carved horse, exquisitely detailed despite its size. "I made this for her, finished it just before she took ill. Never got the chance to give it to her." Abigail leaned closer to admire the carving. "It's beautiful work. You have talented hands, Mr. Reed." "My father taught me. He was a carpenter before." Mason trailed off, then continued in a slightly different direction. "He always said a man should have some way to create beauty in the world, no matter how hard life gets." Wise advice. Abigail found herself sharing in return, compelled by some inexplicable need to connect. "My father was a banker in Boston. He believed appearances were everything, and sentiment was a weakness. When I announced my intention to marry Edwin and move west, he told me I was throwing away everything he'd built for our family." "But you came anyway." "I did." Abigail smiled faintly at the memory of her younger self, so certain she was choosing adventure and true love over stifling convention. "I was 25 and determined to live my own life, not the one laid out for me. Edwin painted such vivid pictures of the frontier, the freedom, the opportunity, the chance to build something meaningful together. And was it what you hoped for?" The question hung between them, more intimate than Mason likely realized. Abigail considered her answer carefully, aware she was sharing thoughts she'd never voiced aloud, not even to Frank, who had witnessed the reality of her marriage. "Parts of it were," she said finally, "the land itself has never disappointed me. There's an honesty to it, a clarity. The seasons come and go, the creek flows, the cattle graze, it all follows natural laws, without pretense or deception." She paused, then added quietly, "But marriage is more complicated than ranching. What looks promising in spring can yield a bitter harvest by autumn." Mason nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. "My mother used to say that some people are born knowing exactly who they're meant to be, but others need to be loved into becoming themselves." The phrase struck Abigail with unexpected force. Your mother was a philosopher as well as a horse whisperer. Just observant, she saw how people, like animals, respond to what's expected of them, either rising to meet the expectation or breaking under it. Mason closed the box gently, his large hands incongruously delicate with the precious items. I think maybe she was trying to tell me something about myself, but I was too young to understand it then. And now, Mason looked up, meeting her gaze directly for perhaps the first time since his arrival at Thornton Ranch. In the deepening twilight, his dark eyes held a mixture of sorrow and something else, a yearning perhaps for connection or understanding that matched her own unexpected longing. Now I wonder if I'll ever have the chance to find out who I might become. Some mistakes follow a man forever, Mrs. Thornton. Some debts can never be paid in full. The weight of unspoken history hung heavy in his words, confirming Abigail's earlier suspicion that Mason Reed was running from something more significant than painful memories. But rather than inspiring caution, his oblique confession only deepened her curiosity and her empathy. I believe we all carry debts of one kind or another, Mr. Reed. She rose from her seat, brushing dust from her riding skirt. The question is whether we allow them to define us. Mason stood as well, towering over her in the gathering darkness, but somehow making his size seem protective rather than threatening. You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Thornton. Not many would offer understanding to a stranger with shadows in his past. Perhaps I recognize those shadows. Abigail surprised herself with the admission. Besides, I've found that most people are neither as simple as their virtues, nor as irredeemable as their mistakes would suggest. Their eyes held for a moment longer than propriety allowed a current of something unnamed passing between them. Then Abigail nodded a polite goodnight and turned toward the path leading back to the ranch house, leaving Mason standing by the creek with his mother's keepsakes and a thoughtful expression on his face. As she walked home through the deepening twilight, Abigail found her thoughts drifting from financial worries to the mysterious Mason Reed. Their conversation had revealed little concrete information about his past, but had offered glimpses of a depth she hadn't expected in intelligence and sensitivity that belied his rough exterior. For the first time in years, she felt a stirring of interest in another person that went beyond practical considerations of their usefulness or reliability. It was a dangerous feeling, one she hadn't experienced since her early days with Edwin, before reality had eroded her romantic notions. She reminded herself firmly that Mason Reed was an employee, a drifter with admitted mistakes. In his past, a man who would likely move on once winter passed. Any personal interest was inappropriate and unwise, particularly given her precarious situation. Yet as she prepared for bed that night, Abigail found herself returning to his mother's philosophy. Some people are born knowing exactly who they're meant to be, but others need to be loved into becoming themselves. She wondered which category she fell into, and whether after all these years of defining herself through duty and responsibility, she might still discover someone new within the woman she had become. Sheriff Daniel Clayton was a patient man by nature and training. 20 years of law enforcement had taught him the value of observation, of allowing situations to develop naturally before intervening. But his patience was being sorely tested by Walter Sullivan's persistent inquiries about Mason Reed. I'm telling you, Clayton, there's something not right about that man. Sullivan leaned across Daniel's desk, his jowls quivering with intensity. Drifts into town with nothing but a saddlebag and a Bible, immediately catches Abigail Thornton's eye, and now he's moving into a private cabin on her property. It's suspicious. Daniel kept his expression neutral, despite his growing irritation. There's nothing suspicious about Mrs. Thornton hiring a skilled horse trainer judge. By all accounts, Reed has made remarkable progress with that stallion everyone thought was unmanageable. Yes, the horse whisperer. Sullivan waved a dismissive hand. Very convenient skill, isn't it? Gives him access to the most valuable animal on the ranch, earns him special treatment. Your point being, Sullivan lowered his voice conspirationally. My sources say Abigail is in serious financial trouble. The bank's calling in Edwin's railroad loan. $5,000 due in 90 days. He smiled, a predatory expression that reminded Daniel why he'd never trusted the man despite his judicial position. She's already sold off the southeast pasture, but it won't be enough. She's desperate, vulnerable. Daniel maintained his professional demeanor with effort. I fail to see how any of this concerns Mason Reed or falls under my jurisdiction as sheriff. Use your imagination, man. Sullivan's pale eyes glittered with frustration. A mysterious stranger appears just when a wealthy widow faces financial ruin. It's the oldest confidence game in the book. He's working his way into her trust, positioning himself to take advantage. The accusation struck too close to Daniel's own unacknowledged concerns. He'd noticed the growing connection between Abigail and Reed, the way their eyes sought each other across the ranch yard, the private conversations by Silver Creek that Frank had mentioned in passing. It stirred both his protective instincts, and he was forced to admit a shameful jealousy he had no right to feel. But Sullivan's interest was far from altruistic. The judge had been circling Abigail like a vulture since Edwin's funeral, his pursuit thinly disguising his true interest in Thornton water rights. "I appreciate your concern for Mrs. Thornton's welfare," Daniel said carefully, "but unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing by Reed, there's nothing for me to investigate." "Being new in town isn't a crime." Sullivan straightened, adjusting his expensive waistcoat with a sharp tug. "Very well. If you won't look into Reed's background, perhaps I'll make some inquiries of my own. I have connections in most major cities between here and the Mississippi." The implied threat hung in the air. Sullivan's connections were notorious for finding or manufacturing whatever information might serve his purposes. "That's your prerogative, Judge," Daniel rose, indicating the meeting was over. "But I'd caution against spreading unfounded rumors about a man who's done nothing to deserve it. Frontier justice works both ways." Sullivan's face darkened at the subtle warning. "Careful, Clayton. Your personal feelings for Mrs. Thornton are hardly a secret, but allowing them to interfere with your duties could be problematic for your position." "Is that a threat, Your Honor?" "Merely an observation." Sullivan moved toward the door. "Think about where your loyalties lie, Sheriff. With the law and the established citizens of this community, or with a widow who never returned your affections, and a drifter who might be anyone." After Sullivan departed, Daniel sat heavily in his chair, troubled by the encounter. The judge rarely showed his hand so openly unless he felt confident in his position or desperate to achieve his aims. Either possibility was concerning. Daniel had always kept his distance from Abigail's business affairs, respecting her independence and avoiding any appearance of using his position to court favor. But Sullivan's revelations about her financial troubles, if accurate, painted a worrying picture. $5,000 was an impossible sum for a ranch to produce on short notice, even one as well-managed as Thornton. And then there was Mason Reed. Daniel had made discreet inquiries about the man, as he would for any newcomer, but had found nothing beyond the usual trail of a drifting worker. Odd jobs in various towns, no criminal record in the territories he'd passed through, no complaints about his work or character. He seemed on the surface exactly what he claimed to be a skilled laborer seeking honest employment. Yet there was something in Reed's careful behavior, the way he maintained awareness of his surroundings at all times, that suggested a man accustomed to watching his back. Not necessarily a criminal, but certainly someone who expected trouble to find him. Daniel had planned to continue his patient observation, but Sullivan's interference forced his hand. If the judge was going to conduct his own investigation, Daniel needed to act first to protect Reed, if he was innocent, to protect Abigail if he wasn't, and to ensure that whatever happened, Sullivan didn't manipulate the situation to his advantage. Decision made, Daniel reached for a sheet of paper and began drafting a telegram to the sheriff's office in Topeka, Kansas. Reed had mentioned working on ranches there, and his mother had recently died in the state. It was a place to start, at least. As he wrote, Daniel found himself hoping the inquiry would reveal nothing concerning. Despite his personal complications regarding Abigail, he'd observed enough of Reed to develop a grudging respect for the man's quiet competence and evident decency. The way he handled animals, the respect he showed to women and elders in town, his willingness to help with community projects like rebuilding the church steps, all spoke to a fundamental goodness that Daniel wanted to believe was genuine. But hope wasn't enough when it came to Abigail's safety. Daniel had failed to protect her from Edwin's poor decisions in life. He wouldn't fail to protect her from potential threats in her widowhood, even if his concern earned him nothing but her continued professional courtesy. He finished the telegram, reading it over to ensure the inquiry seemed routine rather than accusatory. Then he walked to the telegraph office, trying to ignore the voice in his head that questioned whether his actions were truly motivated by duty and concern, or by the jealousy he'd refused to acknowledge even to himself. Mason worked on the cabin every evening after his regular duties were complete, relishing the physical labor that left him too exhausted for troubled thoughts. The structure was sound, as Mrs. Thornton had said, requiring mainly surface repairs, a new roof replacement, of rotted porch boards, fresh chinking between logs to keep out the winter winds. With the materials she generously provided from the ranch's storage shed, he made rapid progress. By the end of the week, the exterior was nearly complete, and he'd begun addressing the interior, sweeping out years of dust and animal nests, repairing the stone fireplace building, simple furniture from salvaged lumber. The work connected him to his father's teachings, to the skills passed down before death had severed that bond too soon. Each evening, as twilight settled over the land, Mason found himself looking towards Silver Creek, hoping for another chance encounter with Abigail Thornton. Their conversation by the water had lingered in his thoughts, her insights and quiet strength impressing him in ways he hadn't expected. There was something compelling about her directness, her refusal to hide behind social niceties or feminine artifice. She was exactly who she appeared to be, a capable woman who had faced adversity and emerged stronger, who carried her burdens with dignity rather than complaint. Mason recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss and resilience, who had rebuilt a life from the wreckage of broken dreams. It was a dangerous recognition, creating a connection he couldn't afford to nurture. His situation was too precarious, his past too shadowed, his future too uncertain to involve someone like Abigail Thornton in his complications. Yet he found himself watching for her during his daily work, appreciating the straight line of her back as she rode across the ranch, the confident way she addressed the hands, the rare smile that transformed her serious features when something pleased her. He noticed details he had no business noticing: the silver threading through her dark hair at the temples, the grace of her hands as she checked the ledgers, the thoughtful expression she wore when observing the ranch operations. It was madness, this growing awareness. She was his employer, a respectable widow, a woman of property and standing in the community. He was a drifter with a price on his head, a man who couldn't afford to stay in one place long enough for anyone to look too closely at his history. But knowing all this didn't stop the quickening of his pulse when, on the sixth evening of cabin repairs, he looked up from setting the last porch board to find Abigail approaching on horseback, a covered basket secured to her saddle. "Mr. Reed," she dismounted with practiced ease, tying her mare to a young aspen at the edge of the clearing. "Frank mentioned you've been working through supper to finish the roof before the weather turns. I thought you might appreciate something more substantial than cold beans from the bunkhouse." Mason straightened, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance, shirt damp with sweat, hands rough from work, hair falling across his forehead where it had escaped its binding. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Thornton. You didn't need to trouble yourself." "No trouble." She carried the basket to the porch steps, surveying his progress with evident approval. "The cabin looks remarkably improved. You work quickly. Had good materials to work with." Mason set aside his hammer, wiping his hands on a rag before accepting the basket. The rich aroma of fresh bread and roasted meat made his stomach growl embarrassingly, reminding him that he'd been too focused on finishing the roof to notice hunger. "Would you care to join me? It's not much, but the porch is solid now." The invitation was presumptuous, crossing the carefully maintained line between employer and employee. Mason expected polite refusal, was already preparing his apology for the inappropriate suggestion. Instead, Abigail nodded, surprising them both. "I'd like that. It's a pleasant evening to dine outdoors." They settled on the newly constructed porch, using an overturned crate as a makeshift table between them. The basket contained a feast by Mason's standards: roast beef sandwiches, pickled vegetables, apple tarts, and a jar of sweet tea. They ate in companionable silence for a time, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I received a telegram today," Abigail said eventually, her tone deliberately casual. "From a breeder in Wyoming who's interested in Midnight Emperor's bloodline. If you can demonstrate the stallion's manageability at the county fair next month, he's prepared to pay a premium for breeding rights." Mason nodded, understanding the significance. Frank had mentioned the ranch's financial difficulties in passing, framing it as cash flow problems rather than the crisis it clearly was. "He'll be ready. We've made good progress this week, managed a saddle blanket on his back yesterday, though a full saddle is still some ways off. That's remarkable progress for a horse everyone considered unrideable. He just needed someone to listen to him instead of trying to break him." Mason took a sip of tea, choosing his next words carefully. "Animals, like people, resist when they feel trapped or threatened. Show them respect and patience, and most will meet you halfway. Abigail studied him over the rim of her own jar, her blue eyes thoughtful in the fading light. You speak from experience, I think. It wasn't quite a question, but the invitation to elaborate was clear. Mason felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever conversation veered toward his past. Yet something about Abigail's direct gaze, the absence of judgment in her expression, made him want to offer at least a partial truth. I spent some time in places where respect was in short supply, he acknowledged. Learned the difference between submission and cooperation the hard way. Abigail nodded, accepting the vague explanation without pressing for details. And yet you've maintained your capacity for gentleness, for seeing the difference between fear and aggression in creatures others would simply label dangerous. The observation delivered with quiet certainty caught Mason off guard. Few people had ever looked beyond his imposing physical presence to recognize the deliberate restraint he practiced, the conscious choice to use his strength for protection rather than dominance. My mother's influence, he said after a moment. She believed in finding the good in difficult situations and broken things. Used to say that God wasn't finished with any of us yet, no matter how lost we might seem. A hopeful perspective. Abigail's expression softened with what might have been wistfulness. I admit I sometimes envy that kind of faith. My own tends to be more practical. Nothing wrong with practicality, gets you through when hope seems foolish. Yes, it does. She brushed crumbs from her riding skirt, her movements precise and controlled. Practicality rebuilt this ranch after Edwin died, kept the hands paid and the cattle fed through 2 harsh winters and a drought. But sometimes I wonder if there should be more to life than simply surviving from one season to the next. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did Mason, a rare glimpse beneath the composed exterior she presented to the world. He recognized the courage it took to voice such thoughts, especially to someone who was in the strict social hierarchy of the ranch, her subordinate. There should be, he agreed quietly. My father used to say that surviving keeps you breathing, but living requires something to breathe for. Abigail looked up sharply, something in his words striking a chord. Your parents sound like they were well matched in wisdom. They were. Mason smiled at memories long buried but still precious. Complete opposites in many ways. He was stern and methodical. She was gentle and intuitive, but they balanced each other. When he died, something essential went out of our lives, though Mother did her best to keep his memory and teachings alive. How did you lose him? The question was gentle, with no expectation of an answer if the topic proved too painful. Mason hesitated, then decided that this much of his history at least was safe to share. Accident at a logging camp in Colorado when I was 12. At least that's what they told us. He'd gone there for winter work while Mother and I stayed with her sister in Kansas. The company sent his belongings and a month's wages, but no body. The old grief surfaced unexpectedly, tightening his throat. Mother always said not having a grave to visit was the hardest part. I'm sorry. Abigail's sympathy was genuine, untainted by the awkward pity such revelations often inspired. That's a difficult loss for a boy on the cusp of manhood. It was. Mason found himself continuing, sharing thoughts he'd rarely voiced aloud. Changed everything. We had to leave our home, move in with my aunt, who resented our presence but needed Mother's help with her own children. I took whatever work I could find, stables, farms, anywhere they'd hire a boy big for his age. Sent every penny home to help support the family. You were just a child yourself. Abigail's voice held a note of protective outrage that warmed something long cold within Mason's chest. Your aunt should have been caring for you both after such a loss. Aunt Grace had her own troubles. Her husband drank away most of what he earned, left her with 5 children to feed. Mason shrugged the old resentments long since worn smooth by time and understanding. She did what she could in her way, and Mother made sure I didn't lose myself in bitterness or anger. Kept reminding me that how we respond to hardship shapes who we become. Your mother sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. Mason gazed out at the darkening landscape, thinking of Sarah Reed's patient endurance, her ability to find joy in small moments, despite their reduced circumstances. I wish I could have done more for her, given her the comfort and security she deserved in her final years. The regret in his voice must have been palpable because Abigail reached across the space between them, her hand coming to rest briefly on his forearm, a gesture of consolation that felt startlingly intimate in the gathering twilight. I'm sure she knew how much you cared, Mr. Reed. Some gifts can't be measured in material terms. Mason looked down at her hand pale against the tan of his skin and felt an unexpected surge of longing, not just for physical connection, though that was certainly part of it, but for the deeper intimacy of being truly known and accepted by another person. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself such vulnerability, such hope. Abigail seemed to realize the boundary she'd crossed and withdrew her hand, though not with embarrassment or regret. There was a deliberateness to her movements that suggested she was as aware as he was of the current flowing between them, a connection neither had sought but both now acknowledged, if only silently. I should return to the house, she said, rising with I should return to the house, she said, rising with the graceful dignity that seemed as natural to her as breathing. Thank you for sharing your supper and your story. Mason stood as well, towering over her in the deepening dusk, yet somehow making his size protective rather than imposing. Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Thornton, and for listening. Their eyes held for a moment longer than propriety allowed, silent communication passing between them, recognition of something fragile yet significant taking root in the space they shared. Then Abigail nodded a polite good night and moved to untie her mare, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. The cabin should be fully habitable by tomorrow evening, Mason said, finding his voice as she prepared to depart. Thanks to your generosity with materials. Good. Winter comes early to these mountains. Abigail gathered her reins, her profile elegant against the twilight sky. And Mr. Reed, I hope you'll continue our conversation another time, perhaps by Silver Creek. With that, she nudged her horse into motion, leaving Mason standing on his newly constructed porch, watching until horse and rider disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did he allow himself to acknowledge the dangerous warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he'd thought himself incapable of after years of solitary caution. It couldn't lead anywhere, this unexpected connection. His circumstances ensured that. But for the first time in 8 years, Mason Reed found himself wondering if there might be a future beyond endless, drifting a life that included more than just survival from one season to the next. It was a dangerous thought, as perilous as the growing attraction to a woman he had no right to desire. But like a seedling pushing through frost-hardened ground, it persisted despite all logic, fragile, but determined to grow toward light. The cabin, when completed, surpassed Abigail's expectations. Mason had transformed the neglected structure into a snug dwelling that reflected both practicality and unexpected artistry. The repaired porch now featured a handcrafted rocking chair positioned to catch the morning sun. Inside, simple furniture crafted from salvaged lumber had been sanded smooth and arranged to make the most of the limited space. A shelf beside the stone fireplace held his mother's Bible and the carved horse, along with several books borrowed from the ranch library at Abigail's invitation. It was a man's domain, spare and functional, yet there was an attention to detail that spoke of someone who valued beauty alongside utility. The carefully beveled edges of the table, the smooth curve of the chair arms, the precise alignment of the floorboards where he'd replaced rotted sections. You've done remarkable work, Mr. Reed, Abigail observed during her inspection of the finished cabin. It was a bright autumn morning, sunlight streaming through freshly cleaned windows to illuminate the transformation. This place hasn't looked so welcoming since the Johnsons lived here years ago. Mason accepted the compliment with characteristic modesty. Had good bones to work with, mainly needed care and attention. Still, there's a craftsmanship here that goes beyond simple repairs. She traced her fingers along the edge of the table he'd built, appreciating the smooth finish. You could have earned a good living as a carpenter with skills like these. Something flickered across his features, regret perhaps, or a memory best left undisturbed. Might have in different circumstances. Life had other plans. Before Abigail could inquire further, they were interrupted by the arrival of Frank Hudson, riding hard from the direction of the main house. Mrs. Thornton, Frank called, reining in his mount. Telegram from Wyoming. That horse breeder is arriving early tomorrow instead of next week. Wants to see Midnight Emperor in action before the county fair. Abigail felt her stomach tighten with both hope and apprehension. The breeder's interest represented their best chance at securing funds to offset the bank debt, but Midnight Emperor was still weeks away from the full demonstration they'd planned for the fair. "How much has he been told about the stallion's progress?" she asked, mind racing through contingency plans. "Only what was in your initial letter, that we have a promising trainer working with him." Frank's expression conveyed his own concern. "Mr. Henderson's reputation precedes him. He's known for his exacting standards and his deep pockets." Abigail added the financial implications clear to all present. She turned to Mason. "How much can you safely demonstrate by tomorrow?" Mason considered the question with the careful thoroughness she'd come to expect from him. "Halter work is solid. Saddle blanket acceptance is good on most days. Basic leading commands are reliable." He paused, weighing honesty against optimism. "A full saddle would be pushing too far too fast. But I could show his progress, his temperament, improvement. Make it clear what Henderson would be investing in." Abigail nodded, appreciating his straightforward assessment. "That will have to suffice. Frank, please tell Anna to prepare the guest room and inform Cook we'll have company for dinner tomorrow, and have Johnson polish the good silver." As Frank departed to carry out her instructions, Abigail found herself clasping her hands tightly, the only outward sign of the pressure bearing down on her. Henderson's visit represented more than a potential business deal. It was perhaps her last chance to save Thornton Ranch without selling more land or accepting Sullivan's increasingly transparent overtures. "He'll see the stallion's value," Mason said quietly, reading her concern. "Midnight Emperor's bloodlines speak for themselves, and his temperament is improving daily. Any horseman worth his salt will recognize the potential." The confidence in his deep voice steadied her, a reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. "I hope you're right, Mr. Reed, because without this breeding contract—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the dire consequences aloud. "The ranch is in trouble." It wasn't a question. Mason's direct gaze held no judgment, only understanding. "I've noticed the belt-tightening, heard the conversation stop when I approach." Abigail hesitated, then decided honesty was preferable to maintain pretense. "Edwin left substantial debts I discovered only recently. The bank has called in a loan he took against the property, $5,000 due within 75 days now. I've already sold the southeast pasture to reduce the amount, but we're still short by $2,000. It was more than she'd intended to reveal, but once begun, the words flowed with surprising relief. For 5 years, she'd carried the ranch's burdens alone, maintaining a facade of complete control, even with Frank. Sharing the truth, even with an employee she'd known only a few weeks, lightened something within her. And this breeding contract would cover the remaining debt. If Henderson agrees to our terms, yes. Abigail straightened her shoulders, reasserting her usual composure. "But that's my concern, not yours. You've been hired to train a horse, not solve the ranch's financial problems." Mason studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "I'd like to help if I can, beyond just preparing the stallion for tomorrow's demonstration." The simple offer, delivered without expectation or condition, touched Abigail deeply. How long had it been since someone had simply offered assistance without ulterior motive or veiled judgment? Even Daniel's well-intentioned support came weighted with their complicated history and his barely concealed feelings. "That's very kind, Mr. Reed, but this is my responsibility. Doesn't mean you have to bear it alone." Mason's words echoed her own earlier thoughts with uncanny precision. Sometimes an outside perspective can reveal options not immediately apparent. Abigail found herself considering his offer seriously despite her instinctive resistance to sharing control. There was a practical intelligence to Mason that she'd observed in his work with the horses, a creative approach to problems that might indeed offer fresh insights. "I'll think about it," she conceded, more open to the possibility than she would have been even a week ago. "For now, let's focus on ensuring Midnight Emperor makes the best possible impression tomorrow. What do you need to prepare?" They spent the next hour discussing strategy for Henderson's visit, planning how best to showcase the stallion's progress while being honest about the work still needed. Throughout the conversation, Abigail was struck by Mason's balanced approach, neither overpromising nor underselling, but presenting realistic assessments with quiet confidence. It was a refreshing change from Edwin's habitual exaggeration and Sullivan's oily assurances. Mason Reed, whatever his mysterious past might contain, was a man who dealt in honest truths rather than comfortable falsehoods. As she rode back to the main house afterward, Abigail found herself reflecting on this quality and the other attributes she'd observed in her newest employee: his patience with difficult animals, his skilled hands capable of both strength and delicacy, his thoughtful intelligence that belied his limited formal education. These professional appreciations were becoming increasingly entangled with more personal observations: the warmth in his dark eyes when he spoke of his mother, the resonant depth of his voice sharing insights by firelight, the careful restraint with which he held his powerful body, always conscious of how his size might intimidate, if not tempered by gentle movement. It was an uncomfortable awareness, one that complicated her already precarious situation. Abigail had spent 5 years rebuilding her identity as the capable widow Thornton respected rancher and businesswoman. She'd put aside the young woman who'd once been swayed by romantic notions, who'd defied her family, for love of a man who ultimately proved unworthy of such sacrifice. Yet here she was, finding her thoughts repeatedly drawn to a ranch hand with a shadowed past and an uncertain future. It was madness, a distraction she could ill afford, with the ranch's fate hanging in the balance. Tomorrow would require her full attention, her sharpest business acumen. Henderson was known as a shrewd negotiator who drove hard bargains even when dealing with men. As a woman in a man's industry, she'd need every advantage to secure terms that would save Thornton Ranch. She couldn't allow personal feelings, however unexpected, to cloud her judgment or divide her focus. Mason Reed was an employee, nothing more, a skilled trainer whose abilities might help secure the breeding contract they desperately needed. That was the story Abigail told herself as she returned to her ledgers and preparations, ignoring the whisper of her heart that suggested a very different narrative was beginning to unfold. The telegram waited on Daniel's desk when he returned from settling a boundary dispute between neighboring farmers. The response from Topeka had arrived sooner than expected, suggesting his inquiry had struck a chord with someone eager to share information. Daniel broke the seal with a mixture of professional duty and personal trepidation. His feelings about Mason Reed had grown increasingly complicated over the past weeks. Initial suspicion had given way to reluctant respect as he observed the man's work ethic and evident decency. The ease with which Reed had integrated into the community, offering his strength to help rebuild the church steps and rescue a child trapped beneath an overturned wagon, spoke to a fundamental goodness that made Daniel question his own motives in investigating the man. Yet Sullivan's warnings and his own protective instincts regarding Abigail had compelled him to seek answers. Now, staring at the telegram's terse message, Daniel felt a sinking sensation in his gut. Reed Mason. Wanted, Topeka, 1877. B&E assault Dr. James Harrington. Warrant still active. Bounty $500. Believed headed west. Exercise caution. Details follow by post. Daniel read the message twice, the implications settling like lead in his stomach. Mason Reed was a fugitive wanted for breaking and entering for assault on a doctor. 8 years was a long time to run from the law, suggesting either a hardened criminal mentality or desperate circumstances that had driven a man to extremes. The mention of Dr. Harrington snagged at Daniel's memory, connecting to something he couldn't immediately place. He searched his mental catalog of conversations, finally recalling Frank Hudson mentioning Abigail's discovery of regular payments in Edwin's journals to a Dr. Harrington in Kansas. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Whatever connection existed between Edwin Thornton, Dr. Harrington, and Mason Reed now seemed deliberately concealed rather than accidental. Had Reed sought out Thornton Ranch specifically because of this link? Was his interest in Abigail genuine, or part of some long-planned retribution? Daniel crumpled the telegram in his fist, frustration and concern warring within him. His duty as sheriff was clear. He should ride to Thornton Ranch immediately, confront Reed with this information, and determine whether to place him under arrest pending extradition to Kansas. But the personal complications gave him pause. Arresting Reed would devastate Abigail on multiple levels, removing her skilled horse trainer just before Henderson's crucial visit and forcing her to confront the possibility that she'd been deceived by a man she was clearly beginning to care for. And what if there were extenuating circumstances? 8 years was a long time. People changed, redeemed themselves through honest work and decent living. The Mason Reed that Daniel had observed in Silverbrush Crossing bore little resemblance to the desperate criminal implied by the telegram. There was also the matter of Sullivan's involvement to consider. The judge had been suspiciously interested in discrediting Reed from the beginning. If Daniel acted precipitously on this information, He might be playing directly into Sullivan's schemes regarding Abigail and her property. No, this situation required careful handling and more complete information. The telegram promised details by post. Perhaps those would provide context that might mitigate Reed's actions or explain the connection to Dr. Harrington. Decision made, Daniel locked the telegram in his desk drawer. He would wait for the promised letter before taking action, using the intervening time to observe Reed more closely and, if opportunity presented itself, to sound out the man's character without revealing what he knew. It wasn't a perfect solution, perhaps not even a strictly proper one by the letter of the law. But frontier justice required discretion and context alongside strict adherence to legal statutes. Daniel had learned long ago that blindly following regulations without considering the human elements involved often created more injustice than it resolved. As he prepared for his evening rounds, Daniel found himself hoping that the full story, when revealed, would offer some explanation that allowed for both legal resolution and personal redemption. Mason Reed had impressed him against his will. The thought of destroying the life the man was building in Silverbrush Crossing brought him no satisfaction, despite his complicated feelings about Reed's growing closeness to Abigail. Tomorrow he decided he would ride out to Thornton Ranch on the pretext of meeting Henderson, the visiting horse breeder. It would give him opportunity to observe Reed in a high-pressure situation and perhaps gauge whether the man posed any genuine threat to Abigail or her interests. Until then, Daniel would keep his discovery to himself, carrying yet another burden of knowledge he couldn't share with the woman who had unknowingly held his heart for most of his adult life. The morning of Henderson's visit dawned clear and cold. The first real bite of autumn carried on a wind that whispered of coming winter. Abigail rose before sunrise, reviewing her negotiation strategy, while Anna helped her dress in her most businesslike attire, a tailored riding skirt and jacket in deep burgundy that conveyed both feminine propriety and professional seriousness. "You look very fine, ma'am," Anna commented as she secured the last pin in Abigail's carefully arranged hair. "That Mr. Henderson won't know what hit him." Abigail smiled at her housekeeper's loyalty. "Let's hope he's more impressed by our stallion than my appearance. Is everything prepared for dinner?" "Cook's been up since 4 making his special roast and apple pie. Johnson's polished the silver till you can see your face in it." Anna adjusted the lace at Abigail's collar with motherly attention. "And Frank's had the hands sprucing up the stable since dawn. Place looks better than Sunday meeting." "Excellent." Abigail surveyed her reflection one final time, noting the tension around her eyes despite her composed expression. So much rested on today's outcome, not just her own future, but the livelihoods of everyone who depended on Thornton Ranch. "And Mr. Reed, has he been informed of the schedule?" "Been at the corral since first light, ma'am. Frank says he slept in the stall with that demon horse last night, getting him used to human presence." Anna shook her head in wonder. "Never seen anything like the way that man has with animals. It's like he speaks their language." Abigail nodded, unsurprised by Mason's dedication. In the weeks since his arrival, she'd observed his thoroughness in every task assigned to him, his willingness to go beyond what was required to achieve the best possible outcome. "I'll check on his progress before breakfast," she decided, gathering her gloves. "Henderson's due at 10. I want to ensure we present a united approach." The ranch was already bustling with activity as Abigail made her way to the main corral. Hands nodded respectful greetings as they hurried about their preparations, the usual easy banter replaced by focused purpose. Everyone understood the stakes of Henderson's visit. She found Mason in the round training pen, moving Midnight Emperor through a series of basic commands. The transformation in the stallion was remarkable. The wild-eyed fury had given way to alert wariness, still spirited, but now channeled into responsive cooperation rather than blind resistance. Mason guided the horse with subtle gestures and quiet words, his large frame moving with the same controlled grace she'd noted during their first encounter. There was a harmony between man and animal that transcended conventional training methods, a communication based on mutual respect rather than dominance. Abigail watched from the fence, reluctant to interrupt the fluid dance unfolding before her. When Mason finally brought the stallion into a perfect halt in the center of the pen, she offered quiet applause. "Impressive work, Mr. Reed. He's hardly recognizable as the same animal that arrived last month." Mason turned, acknowledging her presence with a nod that somehow conveyed both respect for her position and personal warmth. "He's learning to trust again. That's the main hurdle with horses like him, rebuilding faith that humans won't abuse their power." He approached the fence leading Midnight Emperor with nothing more than light pressure on the halter. The stallion followed willingly, ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than laid back in aggression. "May I?" Abigail extended her hand slowly, allowing the horse to catch her scent. "Of course, he's met you before, but approach from the side where he can see you clearly." Abigail followed his instruction, moving to position herself in the stallion's field of vision. Midnight Emperor regarded her with intelligent assessment, nostrils flaring as he processed her scent. After a moment's consideration, he extended his muzzle toward her outstretched hand, the gesture tentative but without fear. The velvety touch of his nose against her palm sent a thrill of connection through Abigail. This magnificent creature, once considered too dangerous to handle, was now willing to accept human contact. It was a small miracle, one that testified to Mason's extraordinary patience and understanding. "He's magnificent," she murmured, stroking the stallion's neck with careful movements. "Henderson will be impressed." "Let's hope so." Mason's deep voice carried a note of caution. "He's made tremendous progress, but he's still learning. We need to manage expectations, make it clear that what Henderson is investing in is potential, not a finished product." Abigail nodded, appreciating his honesty. "I've structured the contract to reflect that initial payment upon agreement, with additional fees as training milestones are reached. It protects both parties while providing the immediate capital we need." They discussed strategy for the demonstration, agreeing on a progression that would showcase the stallion's improved temperament while acknowledging the work still required. Throughout their conversation, Abigail was struck by how naturally they collaborated, each contributing expertise without ego or unnecessary deference. It reminded her of her parents' partnership in their Boston home, her father handling financial matters, while her mother managed the household and social obligations, each respecting the other's domain while working toward shared goals. It was the kind of balanced cooperation she'd hoped for with Edwin, but never achieved, as he'd consistently dismissed her suggestions regarding ranch operations despite her growing expertise. With Mason, there was none of that condescension. He listened to her ideas with genuine consideration, offered his own perspective without insisting on its superiority, and showed the same respect for her business acumen that she accorded his horse training skills. It was a professional harmony that made their personal connection all the more dangerous, the ease between them blurring appropriate boundaries, tempting her toward a closeness she'd sworn to avoid after Edwin's betrayals. "I should return to the house," Abigail said reluctantly, withdrawing her hand from Midnight Emperor's glossy neck. "Henderson will arrive soon, and there are final preparations to oversee." Mason nodded, understanding the shift back to formal roles. "I'll have the stallion ready for demonstration at 11 as planned." "Thank you, Mr. Reed." Abigail hesitated, then added quietly, "For everything. Whatever happens today, you've accomplished something remarkable with this horse." His dark eyes held hers for a moment, conveying more than words could express. "We've both invested in his potential, Mrs. Thornton. That's a powerful combination." The double meaning wasn't lost on Abigail, though neither acknowledged it directly. With a final nod, she turned toward the main house, her steps measured, despite the rapid beating of her heart. Today was about business, about securing Thornton Ranch's future. Personal feelings, however compelling, would have to wait for resolution until that future was assured. Lawrence Henderson arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, driving a polished buggy, pulled by a matched pair of chestnuts that showcased his wealth and eye for quality horseflesh. At 60, the horse breeder cut an impressive figure, tall and lean, with a silver-streaked beard and the weathered complexion of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. His bearing suggested military experience, while his tailored clothes spoke of financial success built on that disciplined foundation. Abigail greeted him on the front porch, extending the hospitality expected of a hostess while maintaining the professional demeanor of a business owner. Henderson, to his credit, responded with similar balance, courteous without condescension, treating her as a fellow rancher rather than a widow playing at business. "Your reputation precedes you, Mrs. Thornton," he remarked as they toured the main stable facilities. "The improvements you've made to this operation since taking over are widely discussed in breeding circles." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I've been fortunate in my staff and my stock." Abigail guided him toward the training area where Frank waited to discuss breeding records and bloodlines. "Thornton Ranch has always prioritized quality over quantity, a philosophy I share." Henderson examined the pregnant mares with an expert's eye, asking pertinent questions about feeding regimens and medical care. Your operation is impressive, particularly given the challenges of recent years. Not many ranches have weathered the economic downturns so successfully. There was a probing quality to his comment that suggested he knew more about their financial situation than she'd revealed in her correspondence. Abigail maintained her composed expression, neither confirming nor denying the implied difficulties. We adapt to changing circumstances, Mr. Henderson. That's the nature of ranching. He nodded, a glint of approval in his keen eyes. Indeed it is, Mrs. Thornton. Indeed it is. The tour continued with discussion of breeding programs and market trends, establishing a foundation of mutual respect before addressing the main purpose of Henderson's visit. As 11 o'clock approached, Abigail guided him toward the round pen where Mason would demonstrate Midnight Emperor's progress. I should warn you, she said as they walked, that the stallion you're about to see was considered unmanageable when he arrived 2 months ago. His previous owners employed traditional breaking methods that only increased his aggression. We've taken a different approach. Henderson's bushy eyebrows rose with interest. Different how? I believe my trainer can best explain his methods himself. Abigail gestured toward the training area where Mason stood waiting, the impressive black stallion ground-tied beside him, a demonstration of control that would be immediately apparent to a horseman of Henderson's experience. As they approached, Abigail made the formal introduction. Mr. Henderson, this is Mason Reed, our head trainer. Mr. Reed Lawrence Henderson of Clearwater Breeding Farms. The two men sized each other up with the careful assessment of individuals accustomed to reading both humans and animals. Henderson's initial surprise at Mason's imposing size quickly gave way to professional curiosity as he noted the stallion's calm demeanor in the trainer's presence. Mr. Reed, Henderson extended his hand. That's quite an animal you have got there. The Thornton Arabian, I presume? Yes, sir. Midnight Emperor. Mason's handshake was firm, but controlled his manner, respectful without being deferential. Mrs. Thornton has explained the purpose of your visit. She has. I understand you've made progress with an animal others deemed untrainable. He was never untrainable, sir. Just misunderstood. Mason indicated the stallion with a subtle gesture. Would you like to see what he's learned so far? For the next hour, Mason demonstrated the stallion's capabilities and progress, explaining his training philosophy as he worked. He showed the horse's acceptance of the halter, his response to basic commands, his tolerance of the saddle blanket, and his gradually improving ground manners. Throughout, he was honest about the work still needed: full saddle acceptance, rider introduction, specialized commands, while emphasizing the animal's intelligence and willingness to learn under the right guidance. Henderson watched with the focused attention of an expert, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed his deep knowledge of horse psychology and training methods. His expression remained carefully neutral, giving no indication of his thoughts until the demonstration concluded. Impressive work, Mr. Reed, he said finally, particularly given the timeline. Most trainers would still be establishing basic trust at this stage, let alone achieving functional commands. Thank you, sir. Midnight Emperor deserves most of the credit. He's exceptionally intelligent. And you've respected that intelligence rather than trying to break it. Interesting approach. Henderson stroked his beard thoughtfully. May I ask where you learned your methods? They're unusual in Western operations. A flicker of something caution, perhaps, or carefully controlled tension crossed Mason's features before he responded. My mother taught me the foundations. She had a special way with difficult animals. I've adapted her approaches over years of working different ranches. Your mother must have been a remarkable horsewoman. She was, sir. The simple statement carried depths of emotion that even Henderson, meeting Mason for the first time, seemed to perceive. Well, I've seen enough of the stallion's progress to make an assessment. Henderson turned to Abigail, his expression now all business. Perhaps we could discuss terms, Mrs. Thornton, privately. Of course. Abigail nodded to Mason. Please continue with Midnight Emperor's regular routine, Mr. Reed. We'll speak later regarding Mr. Henderson's decision. As she led Henderson toward the house for their negotiation, Abigail felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her. This conversation would determine not just the stallion's future, but that of the entire ranch and everyone who depended on it. Her last glimpse of Mason showed him returning the stallion to his stall with the same gentle attentiveness he demonstrated throughout, a man fully invested in his work, regardless of its impact on larger financial considerations. It was that dedication, that integrity of purpose, that had first drawn her attention to Mason Reed. Now, as she prepared to fight for Thornton Ranch's survival, Abigail found herself drawing strength from his example, focusing on what could be accomplished through patience and persistence, rather than dwelling on potential failure. Whatever Henderson decided, she would face it with the same quiet dignity she'd observed in her unlikely ally. Some battles were won not through force, but through steadfast determination and faith in possibilities others couldn't yet see. The negotiation with Henderson proved both more challenging and more promising than Abigail had anticipated. The breeder was indeed impressed by Midnight Emperor's bloodlines and progress, but drove a hard bargain regarding payment terms and breeding rights. The stallion has extraordinary potential, he acknowledged, reviewing the contract she'd prepared. But potential doesn't guarantee results, especially with an animal that has demonstrated such volatility in the past. Which is precisely why our proposed payment structure is staged, Abigail countered, indicating the relevant clauses. Initial payment upon signing, with additional fees as training milestones are reached and successful breedings confirmed. It protects your investment while recognizing the value already established. Henderson's shrewd eyes assessed her across the study desk. Your trainer is the key factor here. His methods are unorthodox but effective. What assurance do I have that he'll remain at Thornton Ranch long enough to complete the stallion's training? It was a pertinent question, one that had nagged at Abigail's own thoughts. Mason Reed had arrived as a drifter, a man accustomed to moving from place to place. Despite the cabin renovation and his evident connection to the ranch, she had no guarantee he wouldn't depart as suddenly as he'd appeared. Mr. Reed has demonstrated exceptional commitment to Midnight Emperor's development, she said carefully. He's invested significant personal effort in establishing the foundation for continued progress. I have every confidence in his dedication to completing what he's begun, but no contractual obligation binding him to this project. Henderson tapped the document with a manicured fingernail. I'm prepared to offer the initial payment you've requested, Mrs. Thornton, but I'd like additional protection regarding the trainer's continued involvement. The implication was clear: either secure Mason's commitment to the project or accept less favorable terms. Abigail considered her options, weighing immediate financial need against long-term implications. I'll speak with Mr. Reed about formalizing his role in the training program, she said finally. Would a signed addendum from him agreeing to complete specific training milestones satisfy your concerns? Henderson nodded approval, gleaming in his eyes. That would be acceptable. I appreciate a business owner who addresses legitimate concerns directly, Mrs. Thornton. It's refreshingly rare in my experience. The remainder of their negotiation proceeded more smoothly, with both parties finding acceptable compromises on minor points of contention. By the time they adjourned for the dinner Anna had prepared, they had reached preliminary agreement on terms that would provide Thornton Ranch with the immediate capital needed to address the bank debt, while establishing a partnership that promised long-term benefits for both operations. It was a substantial victory, though, contingent on Mason's willingness to formalize his commitment, a conversation Abigail wasn't entirely comfortable initiating, given the personal complications that had developed alongside their professional relationship. Dinner proceeded pleasantly, with Henderson proving an engaging guest whose extensive travels provided ample conversation. Frank and Mason joined them at Abigail's invitation, creating a balanced table that allowed for both social niceties and continued discussion of breeding programs and market trends. Abigail noticed that Mason, while quieter than the others, contributed thoughtful observations when directly addressed. His natural intelligence and observant nature compensated for any lack of formal education, allowing him to engage meaningfully with Henderson's more technical questions about training methodology. She also noted with a private warmth she couldn't entirely suppress how carefully he handled the fine china and silver, his large hands moving with deliberate gentleness that spoke of respect for beautiful things, despite his unaccustomed surroundings. There was nothing awkward or uncouth in his manners, simply the unaffected dignity of a man comfortable in his own skin, neither pretending sophistication nor apologizing for its absence. The contrast with Edwin's perpetual social climbing, his desperate need to impress visitors with displays of wealth and refinement, struck Abigail forcefully. Her late husband had never been comfortable with his frontier success, always striving to prove himself worthy of the Boston society he'd married into. Mason, by comparison, seemed entirely at peace with who and what he was, confident without arrogance, respectful without subservience. As coffee was served in the parlor afterward, their dinner conversation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Sheriff Daniel Clayton, his timing too precise to be coincidental. "Forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Thornton," Daniel said, removing his hat as Anna showed him into the parlor. "I heard Mr. Henderson was visiting and wanted to pay my respects before he departed." Abigail performed the necessary introductions, noting the careful assessment in Daniel's eyes as he greeted Mason, a scrutiny that went beyond casual interest or professional awareness. Something had changed in Daniel's attitude toward her horse trainer, some new knowledge or suspicion that hadn't been present during their previous interactions. "Sheriff Clayton and I grew up together in Boston," she explained to Henderson, maintaining social pleasantries despite her unease. "He followed the call west around the same time I did. Though for different reasons," Daniel added with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Thornton came seeking adventure and romance. I was merely looking for a place where family connections mattered less than a man's own abilities." The slight emphasis on family connections carried echoes of old tensions, Daniel's working-class background versus the Thornton wealth and social position that had initially attracted Edwin to Abigail. It was a reminder of the complex history between them, one that Mason observed with quiet attentiveness. Henderson, sensing undercurrents but too polite to acknowledge them, steered conversation towards safer topics: the upcoming county fair, local politics, the railroad expansion that promised to bring increased commerce to the territory. Throughout, Daniel maintained a cordial demeanor while keeping Mason within his line of sight, his attention returning to the trainer whenever he thought himself unobserved. The pattern confirmed Abigail's suspicion that Daniel's visit had ulterior motives beyond social courtesy. Something about Mason had triggered the sheriff's professional interest, and Daniel Clayton was not a man who acted without reason. When Henderson finally announced his intention to return to town for the night, planning to complete their business in the morning, before departing for Wyoming, Abigail seized the opportunity to speak privately with Daniel. As Frank accompanied Henderson to his waiting buggy, and Mason excused himself to check on Midnight Emperor, she detained the sheriff with a gentle hand on his arm. "What brings you really, Daniel? And don't tell me it's social obligation." Daniel's expression tightened, confirming her intuition. "I received information about Reed that concerns me." "What kind of information?" Abigail kept her voice low, though they were alone in the parlor. "Nothing I can discuss officially yet." Daniel glanced toward the door Mason had exited. "But I would advise caution, Abigail. There may be more to your horse trainer than he's revealed." The warning, delivered with evident personal concern rather than professional detachment, stirred both irritation and unease within Abigail. "Mason Reed has been nothing but an asset to this ranch since his arrival. Whatever information you've received should be weighed against the character he's demonstrated here." "Character can be deceptive." Daniel's voice softened, an old tenderness breaking through his official manner. "I've seen you hurt before by men who weren't what they appeared to be. I couldn't prevent it then. I'd like to spare you similar pain now." The reference to Edwin's betrayals was pointed, but Abigail refused to acknowledge the parallel. "I'm not a naive girl anymore, Daniel. I'm quite capable of judging a man's character for myself." "I know you are." He sighed, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. "Just be careful. Don't let personal feelings cloud your judgment, especially with the ranch in such a precarious position." Abigail stiffened, the implied criticism striking a nerve. "My judgment regarding ranch matters has proven sound for 5 years without your guidance, Sheriff. I see no reason to doubt it now." The formal address created deliberate distance between them, signaling an end to the personal aspect of their conversation. Daniel accepted the boundary with a resigned nod. "As you say, Mrs. Thornton, I should be getting back to town." He settled his hat with practiced precision. "Please give Mr. Henderson my regards if I don't see him before he departs." After Daniel left, Abigail remained in the parlor, troubled by the encounter and its implications. What had Daniel discovered about Mason that prompted such concern? And was it genuine information, or merely the protective jealousy of a man who had harbored feelings for her since childhood? More disturbing was the realization that Daniel's warning had resonated with her own unvoiced questions about Mason's past. Despite their growing connection and his evident decency, there remained an air of mystery about the man's careful omissions in his personal history, a watchfulness that suggested habitual caution rather than natural reserve. Abigail prided herself on clear-eyed assessment of people and situations, on decisions based on evidence rather than emotion. Yet with Mason Reed, she'd allowed intuitive trust to outweigh unanswered questions, had accepted his presence and growing importance at Thornton Ranch without the thorough investigation she would have conducted for any other employee in a position of similar responsibility. The recognition was uncomfortable, suggesting that Daniel's warning about personal feelings affecting her judgment might hold more truth than she wished to acknowledge. Tomorrow she would need to speak with Mason about formalizing his commitment to Midnight Emperor's training, a conversation that now carried additional weight given Daniel's cryptic warning. It would provide opportunity to address some of these unresolved questions, to gauge Mason's willingness to commit to Thornton Ranch beyond the immediate future. For tonight, however, Abigail could only sit with her troubled thoughts, caught between growing affection for a man who had proven his worth through actions and nagging doubt about secrets he had yet to reveal. The future of Thornton Ranch hung in the balance, dependent on decisions that increasingly blurred the line between professional judgment and personal trust. It was a precarious position for a woman who had sworn never again to let emotion override practicality, especially when that emotion might be the very thing she'd guarded against since Edwin's death, the dangerous, disruptive power of love taking root where it had no business growing. Mason checked on Midnight Emperor one final time before heading toward his cabin, the evening's events weighing heavily on his mind. The demonstration for Henderson had gone better than expected, the stallion responding to commands with consistent cooperation that showcased his progress. The breeding contract, when finalized tomorrow, would provide Thornton Ranch with desperately needed funds while establishing a professional reputation for Mason that might, under different circumstances, have represented a turning point in his life. But circumstances weren't different. The reality of his situation remained unchanged. A wanted man couldn't afford to build a future anywhere, least of all in a place where he'd begun to care deeply for people who would be tainted by association if his past were revealed. The arrival of Sheriff Clayton had only reinforced this uncomfortable truth. Mason had recognized the shift in the lawman's demeanor, immediately the careful scrutiny, the positioned stance that kept Mason always in view, the pointed questions about his background and training experience. Something had changed. Some information had reached Clayton that transformed Mason from a person of mild interest into a subject of specific concern. It was a familiar pattern one Mason had witnessed in other towns when his past began catching up to him. The sidelong glances, the interrupted conversations when he approached the subtle withdrawal of casual friendships, all precursors to the moment when running became the only option. He'd hoped for more time at Thornton Ranch, had allowed himself to imagine a future here despite knowing better. The connection with Midnight Emperor had been unexpected, a bond that transcended traditional training and relationships to become something more like partnership. And his feelings for Abigail Thornton had developed from respectful admiration into something deeper and more dangerous with each conversation, each shared moment of understanding. Now it seemed his time was running short. Sheriff Clayton's knowledge, whatever its extent, would eventually become action. Mason had no illusions about that. The only questions were how much time remained before that happened and what obligations he needed to fulfill before departing. The breeding contract was foremost among these responsibilities. Abigail was counting on the partnership with Henderson to save her ranch, and Mason's involvement was clearly central to the breeder's interest. He wouldn't leave before ensuring that agreement was secured, even if staying increased his personal risk. Beyond that immediate concern lay the deeper question of what, if anything, he should tell Abigail about his past. The connection between them had grown too significant for comfortable deception, yet full disclosure would place her in an impossible position, forced to choose between harboring a known fugitive and betraying someone she had come to trust. It was an unfair burden to place on her, particularly given her already precarious situation. Yet leaving without explanation would be its own form of betrayal, abandoning her to questions and doubts that might undermine her confidence in her own judgment. Mason reached his cabin with these troubled thoughts circling in his mind. The small structure had become more home to him in a few weeks than any place he'd stayed in 8 years of drifting. The furniture he'd crafted with his own hands. The books borrowed from Abigail's library, carefully arranged on shelves. He'd built the rocking chair positioned to catch both morning sun and evening starlight. All testified to a settling, a putting down of roots he'd denied himself since that desperate night in Topeka. As he lit the lantern and built a small fire against the autumn chill, Mason found himself remembering his mother's words about home being less about place than about connections to people who saw and valued your true self. For 8 years, he'd been without that essential anchor, drifting through communities where he was known only superficially, never allowing others close enough to recognize the person beneath the careful facade. At Thornton Ranch, for the first time since his mother's death, Mason had experienced the dangerous comfort of being seen by Midnight Emperor, whose animal intuition recognized his genuine nature beneath the imposing size that intimidated most humans. By Frank Hudson, whose gruff acceptance had evolved into genuine respect, and most significantly by Abigail herself, whose perceptive gaze seemed to read the unspoken truth behind his careful words. The thought of losing these connections, of returning to the solitary existence he'd endured for so long, created an ache in his chest that no logical argument could ease. Yet what alternative existed? To stay would be to bring danger to the very people who had offered him acceptance and trust. To stay would be selfish, prioritizing his own happiness over their well-being and safety. A soft knock at the cabin door interrupted these bleak reflections. Mason tensed instinctively, scanning the room for potential weapons or escape routes, habits ingrained through years of vigilance. Then he caught himself, shaking his head at the ingrained paranoia that remained his constant companion. "Who is it?" he called, moving toward the door with measured steps. "Abigail Thornton." Her voice carried clearly through the wooden panels. "I apologize for the late hour, but there's a matter we need to discuss before tomorrow's meeting with Henderson." Mason opened the door to find her standing on his porch, a lantern in one hand and a folder of papers in the other. She wore a shawl over her dinner dress, protection against the night chill, and her expression was composed but serious. "Mrs. Thornton." He stepped back, gesturing her inside with reflexive courtesy. "Please come in." She entered with a nod of thanks, her gaze taking in the cabin's interior with evident approval. "You've made this place truly habitable. It's quite impressive." "Thank you." Mason moved to stoke the fire, adding another log to chase away the evening coolness. "You mentioned Henderson." "Yes." Abigail set her lantern on the table alongside the folder. "Our negotiations have gone well overall, but there's one condition he's insistent upon before finalizing the agreement." Mason gestured toward the chair he'd crafted, taking the opposite seat when she was settled. "What condition?" "He wants assurance that you'll remain at Thornton Ranch to complete Midnight Emperor's training." Abigail met his gaze directly. "He's impressed with your methods, but concerned about investing in a program that might be interrupted if you were to move on." The hesitation in her final words suggested deeper concerns than Henderson's financial interests alone. Mason considered his response carefully, weighing honesty against prudence. "It's a reasonable concern from a business perspective," he acknowledged. "Consistency is important in horse training, particularly with an animal as sensitive as Midnight Emperor." "Indeed." Abigail opened the folder, removing a document that appeared to be an addendum to the main contract. "Henderson has proposed a formal arrangement that would bind you to specific training milestones over the next 6 months, with appropriate compensation for your expertise." 6 months. The time frame stretched before Mason like an impossible horizon, far longer than he'd remained in any single location since leaving Kansas. 6 months of deepening connections, of growing attachment to Thornton Ranch and its remarkable owner. 6 months during which Sheriff Clayton's suspicions could transform into certainty, bringing Mason's past crashing into a present he'd come to value more than his own safety. "I sense hesitation, Mr. Reed." Abigail's perceptive gaze missed nothing. "Is there some reason you're reluctant to commit to completing what you've begun here?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications that extended far beyond professional considerations. It was an opening, an opportunity to address the unspoken current that had developed between them alongside their working relationship. Mason leaned forward slightly, his large hands clasped between his knees in a posture that made his imposing size less intimidating. "Mrs. Thornton, Abigail, there are things about my past that you don't know, things that might make such a commitment complicated. Sheriff Clayton seems to think so as well." Her direct response caught him off guard. "He paid me a visit after you left the parlor. Said he'd received information that concerned him, though he declined to specify its nature." The confirmation of his earlier suspicion sent a chill through Mason despite the fire's warmth. Clayton knew something, perhaps not everything, but enough to raise serious concerns. The window of relative safety was closing faster than he'd anticipated. Did he advise you against continuing our professional association? Mason kept his tone neutral, though the answer mattered more than he wished to acknowledge. He suggested caution. Abigail studied him with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than most. But I found that men's warnings about other men often have motivations beyond simple concern. The observation delivered with dry insight reminded Mason that Abigail Thornton was no naive girl easily manipulated or misled. She was a woman of experience and in judgment, capable of making her own assessments regardless of others' opinions. Clayton has known you since childhood, he noted. His concern may be genuinely protective rather than motivated by jealousy. Perhaps. Her slight smile acknowledged the complexity of her history with the sheriff. But that doesn't answer my original question, Mr. Reed. Is there some reason you're reluctant to commit to Thornton Ranch for the period this contract would require? Mason drew a deep breath, reaching a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. There is. Not because I don't want to stay, these past weeks have been the closest thing to home I've known in years, but because staying might eventually bring complications that could harm the ranch, its reputation, and you. What kind of complications? Her voice remained steady, her expression open rather than alarmed. The kind that follow a man with a pate he's not proud of. Mason held her gaze, offering as much truth as he dared. 8 years ago, I made a desperate choice that changed the course of my life. There are people, official people, who haven't forgotten that choice, who might still be looking for the young man who made it. Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes, though, without the judgment or fear he'd expected. You're wanted by the law. It wasn't a question, but Mason nodded confirmation anyway. For an act I don't deny committing, though the circumstances were complicated. I see. Abigail was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. Then with characteristic directness she asked, "Did you hurt someone intentionally, take a life?" "No." The denial came swiftly, vehemently. "I would never." Mason caught himself, moderating his tone. "No, I broke into a doctor's office to obtain medicine for my mother when she fell ill. The doctor caught me in the act. There was a struggle, and he was injured. A broken nose, nothing life-threatening. But in the eyes of the law, it was breaking and entering assault. Serious charges. And the medicine, did it help your mother?" The question touched the rawest part of his grief, the futility that had haunted him for 8 years. "No. She died 3 days later, despite everything I risked to save her." Compassion softened Abigail's features, genuine understanding, replacing the cautious assessment of moments before. "I'm sorry, Mason, truly sorry." The use of his given name, so rare from her lips, created an intimacy that transcended their usual careful formality. It was a small gesture, yet profound in its acceptance. The irony, Mason continued, finding unexpected relief in finally sharing the burden he'd carried alone for so long, is that I left money to pay for the medicine. I wasn't stealing in the usual sense, just desperate for treatment the doctor had refused to provide without payment in advance. Money we didn't have until I'd sold our last horse the next morning. So your crime was essentially one of timing, not intent. The law doesn't recognize such distinctions. Mason's smile held no humor. Breaking and entering is breaking and entering regardless of motivation. An assault is assault, even when accidental. Abigail nodded, acknowledging the rigid framework of legal statutes that often failed to accommodate the complexities of human circumstances. "Have you been running all this time? 8 years is a long sentence to impose on yourself." The insight struck Mason forcefully. He had indeed created his own prison, one without walls, but equally confining, denying himself connections, home stability, the ordinary comforts of belonging that most people took for granted. "I couldn't risk capture," he explained. "Not after what happened to my cellmate during the 3 days I spent in jail before posting bail. Prison would have been a death sentence for someone my size, either targeted by guards for my strength or by other inmates trying to prove themselves. So you chose exile instead." It seemed the only option at the time. "Leave Kansas, keep moving, never stay long enough for anyone to look too closely at my history or ask too many questions." Mason gestured around the cabin. "Until Thornton Ranch, until Midnight Emperor, until—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought aloud, though its conclusion hung unspoken between them. "Until you." Abigail rose from her chair, moving to stand before the fire. The flames cast her profile in gold and shadow, highlighting the straight spine and lifted chin that had become so familiar to Mason over the past weeks. 8 years is a long time, she said finally. Statutes of limitations, changes in territorial law, the passage of time itself all might affect your legal situation. And a broken nose, while painful, is hardly the kind of injury that justifies hunting a man across state lines for nearly a decade. Mason watched her, hardly daring to hope she might be suggesting what her words implied. "What are you saying, Mrs. Thornton?" She turned to face him, fully decision evident in her clear gaze. "I'm saying that before we make any determinations about this contract, I'd like to understand exactly what legal jeopardy you face. Not rumors or fears, but facts. With your permission, I'll write to the authorities in Kansas, inquire about the status of your case without revealing your location." The offer stunned Mason. After 8 years of assuming the worst, of expecting rejection should his past be discovered, Abigail's practical approach to addressing, rather than fleeing the situation, represented a perspective he hadn't considered. "You would do that, risk association with someone in my position. I'm proposing a factual inquiry, not harboring a fugitive." Her practical tone belied the significance of her offer. "Knowledge is preferable to speculation, Mr. Reed, and decisions based on accurate information are generally sounder than those founded on fear or assumption." Mason studied her, this remarkable woman who faced challenges with such clear-eyed determination. "And if the inquiry confirms that I'm still actively wanted, that the charge remains serious, then we'll address that reality when it's confirmed." Abigail's steady gaze held his. "But I won't lose a valuable trainer in a promising business arrangement based on possibilities rather than certainties. Thornton Ranch has faced too many actual crises to manufacture hypothetical ones." The practical framing of her offer allowed both of them to maintain the fiction that her interest was purely professional, that the growing personal connection between them played no role in her decision. It was a courtesy Mason appreciated, preserving dignity and appropriate boundaries while extending unexpected support. "Thank you," he said, simply, the words inadequate to express his gratitude. "I would welcome clarity about my situation, whatever the outcome." Abigail nodded, returning to business with characteristic efficiency. "Then I suggest we proceed as follows. You'll sign the training addendum to secure Henderson's agreement, with the understanding that if legal complications arise that prevent you from fulfilling its terms, I'll assume responsibility for finding a suitable replacement." It was a reasonable compromise, protecting both Thornton Ranch's interests and Mason's freedom to act if circumstances required his departure. Yet underlying the practical arrangement was something more profound: trust extended, where most would have withdrawn its support offered, where judgment might have been expected. "I agreed to those terms," Mason said, rising to his full height with the decision made. "And I give you my word that as long as remaining at Thornton Ranch doesn't place you or others in jeopardy, I'll complete Midnight Emperor's training as specified." "I'll hold you to that promise, Mr. Reed." Abigail extended her hand to seal their agreement, the gesture both professional and deeply personal in its implications. Mason took her offered hand, enveloping her smaller fingers in his careful grip. The contact sent a current of connection through him that had nothing to do with business arrangements, and everything to do with the trust she'd extended, the acceptance she'd offered, despite knowing the shadows in his past. For a moment they stood thus connected, neither withdrawing from the simple touch that carried such complex meaning. Then Abigail gently reclaimed her hand, gathering the contract papers with practiced efficiency. "I'll prepare the inquiry to Kansas tomorrow after Henderson departs," she said, moving toward the door. "Until then, we'll proceed as planned with finalizing the breeding agreement." "Yes, ma'am." Mason followed her to the porch, watching as she adjusted her shawl against the night chill. "And Abigail, thank you for listening, for not immediately assuming the worst." She paused on the top step, looking back at him with an expression that combined understanding with something deeper, something neither of them was quite ready to name. "We all have pasts we wish were different, Mason. What matters is the choices we make now with the knowledge and wisdom those pasts have given us." She lifted her lantern, its glow illuminating her features in the darkness. "Good night." As he watched her walk toward the main house, her straight back and measured stride projecting the same quiet dignity that had first caught his attention, Mason felt something shift within his chest, a loosening of the tight coil of fear and isolation he'd carried for 8 long years. For the first time since that desperate night in Topeka, He allowed himself to consider the possibility of a future that included more than endless running, a future with connections, purpose, perhaps even the home and family he'd abandoned hope of claiming. It was a dangerous hope, one that might yet prove misplaced depending on what Abigail's inquiry revealed. But as Mason returned to his cabin, to the small space he'd transformed with his own hands into something approaching a home, he found himself unwilling to surrender that fragile possibility without at least seeing where it might lead. The morning following Henderson's visit dawned with promise despite the biting chill that heralded approaching winter. The breeding contract had been signed with terms favorable to both parties, Henderson gaining access to Midnight Emperor's exceptional bloodlines, and Thornton Ranch receiving sufficient immediate payment to address the bank debt, with a small cushion remaining for winter expenses. As Abigail watched Henderson's buggy disappear down the winding road toward town, she felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The ranch's immediate financial crisis had been averted, but new uncertainties loomed. Uncertainties centered around the tall figure currently leading Midnight Emperor through his morning exercises in the training pen. Mason Reed, a man of evident decency and remarkable skill, whose quiet strength had become increasingly important to both Thornton Ranch's operations and Abigail's personal sense of stability. A man who had confessed to a criminal past that might yet threaten the fragile peace she'd established in the years since Edwin's death. The revelation of his legal troubles should have prompted immediate caution, perhaps even termination of his employment. Yet Abigail found herself unwilling to make such a decision without complete information, or at least that was the rational explanation she offered herself for the course of action she'd chosen. The truth which she was reluctantly beginning to acknowledge was that her interest in Mason's situation extended far beyond practical ranch considerations. Somewhere between their first encounter and last night's honest conversation in his cabin, he had become important to her in ways that defied simple categorization. Not quite friendship, though elements of that were certainly present. Not merely professional respect, though his skills and work ethic had earned that many times over. Something deeper had taken root, a connection based on mutual understanding, on recognition of kindred spirits, despite their different backgrounds and experiences. It was dangerous territory for a woman who had sworn off emotional entanglements after Edwin's betrayals. Yet here she stood preparing to write letters that might help a wanted man clarify his legal status, actions that went well beyond an employer's obligation or a friend's support. With a determined shake of her head, Abigail turned back toward the house. Henderson's departure meant she could focus on the inquiry she'd promised Mason, a factual investigation that would provide clarity whatever the outcome. She had contacts in the legal profession, from Edwin's business dealings and connections, that could make discreet inquiries without revealing Mason's location. In her study with its familiar comforts of books and business records, Abigail composed 2 careful letters. The first, addressed to a lawyer in Topeka who had handled some of Edwin's railroad investments, requested information about the legal status of charges against Mason Reed dating from 1877, breaking and entering assault on one Dr. James Harrington. The second, directed to the doctor himself if he could be located, sought clarification about the incident and whether he had any continuing interest in pursuing charges. Both letters emphasized the passage of time and requested confidentiality, framing the inquiry as a matter of historical interest rather than current investigation. It was a careful balance, seeking information without revealing Mason's whereabouts or Abigail's personal interest in his situation. As she sealed the envelopes, Abigail's gaze fell on Edwin's journals, still stacked neatly on the bookshelf, where she'd returned them after discovering the mysterious references to Dr. Harrington and the Reed family. The coincidence had nagged at her subconscious since Mason's arrival, but she had dismissed it as nothing more than shared common names. Now, with Mason's revelation about his legal troubles involving a Dr. Harrington in Kansas, the potential connection seemed too precise to ignore. Had Edwin known about Mason's situation? Had there been some business relationship between her late husband and the doctor? Mason had allegedly assaulted. Driven by renewed curiosity, Abigail retrieved the journal containing the most explicit references and opened it to the marked passage, "Met with Dr. Harrington again today. The guilt grows heavier each year, but he assures me the money is being well invested for when he locates the Reed family. 10 years since that terrible night and still no peace." The entry was dated 3 years before Edwin's death, placing the terrible night in question around 1869, well before Mason's incident with Dr. Harrington in 1877. But the Reed family connection remained intriguing. Could Mason's family be the same Reeds that Edwin had been trying to locate through Dr. Harrington? Abigail continued reading, finding scattered references throughout the journal to payments sent to Kansas and Edwin's growing concern that the boy and his mother would never receive the compensation he felt they deserved. The entries were frustratingly vague about the nature of this obligation, referring only to the accident and my responsibility without specific details. One passage, however, stood out with painful clarity. Dreams again last night. Reed's face as the log slipped the sound no man should hear. Woke sweating throat raw from screaming. Harrington says time will ease the guilt. But how can it when his widow and son live in poverty because of my negligence? The money is poor compensation, but it's all I can offer now. Abigail sat back, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The implications were staggering. If her suspicions were correct, Edwin had been involved in some accident that had killed Mason's father. The logging camp incident Mason had mentioned during their conversation by the creek. And Dr. Harrington had been acting as intermediary, attempting to deliver compensation to Sarah Reed and her son. Compensation that had apparently never reached them, leaving Mason's mother to struggle supporting her son, eventually falling ill without means to pay for medical treatment, the very circumstance that had driven Mason to break into Dr. Harrington's office in desperation. The tragic irony of the situation struck Abigail with force. If Edwin's attempted restitution had actually reached the Reed family, Mason's mother might have received proper medical care, might have survived the illness that claimed her life. Mason himself might have avoided the desperate act that had forced him into 8 years of running, of isolation, of denied opportunities. It was a connection too coincidental to dismiss, yet too incredible to fully accept without confirmation. Abigail needed more information before approaching Mason with such potentially devastating revelations, information that might be contained in the letters she just prepared for mailing. With renewed urgency, she added a postscript to her letter to Dean Harrington, inquiring specifically about any connection between Edwin Thornton and the Reed family, particularly regarding compensation for an accident involving Mason's father. Then she gathered the correspondence for immediate dispatch to town, determined that this tangle of past connections would finally be unraveled, whatever painful truths might be revealed. As she prepared to summon Frank to take the letters, a commotion in the yard drew her attention. Through the study window, she saw Sheriff Daniel Clayton dismounting, his expression grave as he spoke with one of the ranch hands. Beside him was another man Abigail didn't recognize, tall and lean, with the hard eyes and watchful posture of someone accustomed to violence. Something in the stranger's bearing, the way he scanned the property with calculating the assessment, the hand that never strayed far from his holstered pistol, triggered an immediate sense of danger. This was no social call, no routine visit from the local sheriff. Daniel Clayton had brought trouble to Thornton Ranch, and Abigail had little doubt about its intended target. Mason felt the change in atmosphere before he saw its cause. The rhythm of the ranch morning hands moving purposefully between tasks, horses nickering for their feed, the distant lowing of cattle shifted subtly, conversations dropping to whispers, gazes darting toward the main yard where riders had just arrived. He continued working with Midnight Emperor, maintaining the calming routine that had built trust between them, but his senses heightened to the approaching disturbance. Years of vigilance had honed his awareness of potential threats, had taught him to recognize the charged silence that preceded confrontation. When Frank appeared at the corral fence, his weathered face tight with concern, Mason knew his borrowed time at Thornton Ranch was drawing to a close. "Sheriff's here," Frank said without preamble. "Got some hard-looking fellow with him. They're asking for you." Mason nodded, unsurprised, yet still feeling the blow of inevitability. "Bounty hunter. Looks the type, has papers, according to Johnson, who saw them talking to Mrs. Thornton." Frank's loyalty showed in his direct gaze. "Back gate's unguarded if you're of a mind to use it. Could have a good head start before anyone realized." The offer touched Mason deeply, a risk Frank wouldn't take lightly given his position and long service to Thornton Ranch. "I appreciate that more than I can say, Frank, but I'm done running." The decision had crystallized sometime during the night after Abigail's visit to his cabin. 8 years of looking over his shoulder, of temporary connections abandoned before they could deepen, of denying himself the ordinary comfort of belonging. It had become a prison, more confining than any jail cell. Whatever consequences awaited Mason would face them directly with the dignity his mother had taught him was every person's birthright, regardless of circumstances. "Mrs. Thornton's in the study with them now," Frank added. Said to tell you they're waiting, but there's no rush. She was particular about that last part. No rush. The message was clear in its implicit support. Abigail was buying him time if he chose to use it, extending the same consideration she'd shown in their private conversation. The knowledge strengthened his resolve to meet whatever came with honesty rather than evasion. Tell her I'll be there directly after settling Midnight Emperor. Mason guided the stallion toward his stall with gentle pressure on the halter. And Frank, thank you for everything. The older man nodded gruffly, emotion a disguise beneath his weathered exterior. Been good having you here, Reed. Best horseman I've worked with in 40 years of ranching. Whatever happens in there, remember that. As Frank departed to deliver his message, Mason took care completing Midnight Emperor's morning routine fresh water, measured feet a final stroke along the gleaming black neck. The stallion had come to represent possibility in Mason's mind, the potential for transformation from wounded wariness to trusting partnership. That work would continue without him, now the foundation he'd established carrying forward under someone else's guidance. The thought brought unexpected grief, a sense of interrupted purpose that cut deeper than mere professional disappointment. In Midnight Emperor, as in Thornton Ranch itself, Mason had found something worth investing in beyond immediate survival, a future he had allowed himself to imagine being part of, despite knowing better. Be patient with whoever comes after me, he murmured to the stallion, receiving a gentle nudge against his shoulder in response. They won't understand you the way I do, but they'll learn if you give them chance. With his responsibilities to the horse complete, Mason turned toward the main house, each step measured and deliberate. He'd known this moment might come from the day he'd accepted Abigail's job offer, had prepared himself for the inevitable recognition exposure consequences. The only surprise was how much it hurt now that the moment had arrived, not fear of punishment, but grief for connections about to be severed, possibilities about to be foreclosed. Most of all, regret for the conversations with Abigail that would never happen, the deepening understanding that had begun between them that would never reach its natural conclusion. In another life with different choices behind him, Mason might have allowed himself to explore the growing affection he felt for this remarkable woman. Might have discovered whether the connection between them could evolve from mutual respect into something more profound. But that possibility, like so many others, would remain unexplored, another casualty of that desperate night in Topeka 8 years ago, when a young man's love for his dying mother had set in motion consequences that continued to shape his existence. Mason Reed straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and walked toward whatever justice awaited him in Abigail Thornton's study. Whatever happened next, he would face it as the man his mother had raised him to be, with honesty, dignity, and the quiet strength that came from knowing his own heart, whatever others might judge of his actions. Abigail stood beside her desk, deliberately maintaining the position of authority in her own home, despite the unwelcome intrusion. Sheriff Clayton had introduced his companion as Ramsey, a representative of Kansas Territorial Justice, with papers authorizing Mason Reed's arrest and return to Topeka for trial. These warrants are 8 years old, Daniel, she observed, examining the documents with careful attention. Hardly suggestive of an urgent threat to public safety. The law doesn't expire, Mrs. Thornton. Ramsey's voice carried the harsh edge of a man accustomed to intimidation rather than reasoned argument. Reed assaulted a respected physician, broke into his place of business, stole valuable medicines. Justice has been delayed, not abandoned. Interesting you should mention Dr. Harrington. Abigail returned the papers to her desk, her composure deliberate in the face of Ramsey's barely concealed aggression. I've just prepared correspondence to the doctor inquiring about the incident. It seems there may be circumstances not reflected in these warrants. Daniel Clayton's expression shifted subtly, concern perhaps, or something more complicated. Abigail, whatever personal interest you have developed in Reed, the fact remains he's a fugitive from justice. My duty requires me to assist in his lawful return to Kansas. Your duty, Abigail replied evenly, extends to ensuring justice is properly served, not merely enforced. These papers contain charges, not convictions. Mr. Reed deserves the opportunity to present his defense before an impartial court, not summary transportation by a representative whose interest appears more financial than judicial. Ramsey's face darkened at the implied criticism. $500 is standard bounty for felony charges. I'm simply doing my job, ma'am. and I'm simply ensuring due process is observed on my property. Abigail's tone could have frosted glass despite the fire crackling in the study hearth. Mr. Reed has been an exemplary employee of Thornton Ranch. I will not see him treated like common criminal without proper consideration of all relevant facts. The tension in the room was palpable when a knock at the door announced Mason's arrival. He entered with quiet dignity, his imposing height made more striking by the careful control with which he held himself, power deliberately restrained, strength tempered by consciousness of its potential impact. His dark eyes took in the situation with a single sweep, noting positions, tensions, the papers on the desk. Then his gaze met Abigail's, communicating silent acknowledgement of her evident support, before turning to face the men who had come to claim him. Sheriff Clayton, Mr. Ramsey. The recognition in his voice when addressing the bounty hunter confirmed Abigail's suspicion that there was history between the two men beyond the current warrant. I understand you've come for me. Mason Reed. Ramsey's hand drifted toward his holstered weapon, a movement that appeared more habitual than immediately threatening. You've led me quite a chase. 8 years is a long time to hunt one man. 8 years is a long time to run. Mason's response held no self-pity, merely statement of fact. I won't be running anymore. The simple declaration caught Ramsey off guard, his predatory anticipation deflated by Mason's calm acceptance. You're coming back to Topeka without resistance. I'll face whatever consequences await me there. Mason's steady gaze shifted to Daniel. Though I would request the courtesy of proper legal representation and fair proceedings, Sheriff Clayton. The circumstances of that night were not as straightforward as the charges suggest. Daniel nodded professional, despite the personal complications evident in his expression. You'll receive full due process, Reed. I give you my word on that. And safe transport, Abigail interjected firmly. I'm familiar with incidents where prisoners never reach their intended destinations, particularly when bounty payment requires only proof of identity, not live delivery. Ramsey's eyes narrowed at the accusation implicit in her words. You questioning my professional integrity, ma'am? I'm establishing expectations regarding Mr. Reed's treatment while he remains under your authority. Abigail's voice carried the same commanding presence she used when negotiating cattle prices or directing ranch operations. Sheriff Clayton will accompany you to ensure those expectations are met. The request framed a statement of fact placed Daniel in a difficult position. Technically, his jurisdiction ended at county lines, making accompaniment to Kansas well beyond his official duties. Yet the steel in Abigail's gaze made clear this was no casual suggestion, but a condition of her cooperation. Before Daniel could respond, the study door opened again, admitting Frank Hudson with an envelope in his weathered hand. Telegram just arrived, Mrs. Thornton. Marked urgent. Frank extended the message, his posture conveying protective alertness as he assessed the tension in the room. Abigail accepted the envelope with a nod of thanks, breaking the seal with deliberate movements that betrayed none of the apprehension she felt. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, urgent correspondence arriving at the exact moment Mason faced arrest. Either fortuitous intervention or damning confirmation seemed equally possible. As she unfolded the single sheet, her eyes widened slightly, the only visible reaction to whatever news it contained. She read the message twice, her expression shifting from surprise to something more complex. It appears, she said, finally looking up to address the room at large, that there have been significant developments regarding Mr. Reed's legal situation. Mason felt his heart rate accelerate despite his outward calm. Abigail's careful phrasing suggested information that might impact his circumstances, but her neutral tone gave no indication whether that impact would be positive or negative. This telegram is from Dr. James Harrington himself. Abigail held up the paper as if its physical presence validated her words. He confirms receipt of my inquiry and has responded with remarkable haste given the circumstances. What's Harrington got to do with this? Ramsey demanded, suspicion evident in his narrowed gaze. The warrants are valid regardless of the victim's current opinions. Perhaps in the strictest legal sense, Abigail conceded. But when the alleged victim states explicitly that he never desired prosecution in the first place, that charges were filed by an overzealous prosecutor against his wishes, the context seems relevant to current proceedings. Mason stared at her, hardly daring to process the implications of her words. Dr. Harrington never wanted me charged. According to this telegram, no. Abigail's eyes met his, conveying both professional satisfaction at this development and something more personal gladness, perhaps that his character, as she'd come to know it, was vindicated by this revelation. He states that while he was indeed injured during your encounter, he recognized your desperate circumstances and would have provided the medicine had he been approached directly. That's not what the warrant says, Ramsey interjected, though, with less certainty than before. Prosecutor was clear about Harrington pressing charges. Prosecutors sometimes pursue cases without victim support, particularly when political considerations are involved. Daniel's observation carried the weight of his years in law enforcement. May I see the telegram? Abigail. She handed him the paper, watching as he read with professional attention to detail. His expression shifted gradually from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. Harrington specifically requests withdrawal of all charges, Daniel confirmed, looking up from the message. Says he's been attempting to locate Reed for years to inform him of this development, but previous communications through official channels were apparently misdirected. The careful phrasing suggested deliberate interference rather than simple bureaucratic error. Mason glanced at Ramsey, noting the bounty hunter's tightening expression, a man seeing potential payments slipping from his grasp. Doesn't matter what Harrington wants now, Ramsey insisted. Warrant's still active. My authority's still valid. Your authority extends only as far as the warrant's legitimacy, Daniel countered. If the alleged victim has withdrawn support for prosecution and actively seeks dismissal of charges, that legitimacy is significantly compromised. The standoff between law enforcement approaches Ramsey's rigid adherence to documentation versus Daniel's more nuanced understanding of justice created palpable tension in the study. Mason remained silent, recognizing that his future hung in the balance of this procedural debate. There's more, Abigail said, reclaiming the telegram from Daniel. Dr. Harrington also confirms a connection I had begun to suspect between Mason's situation and my late husband. This unexpected direction caught everyone's attention, most particularly Mason's. He stared at Abigail with growing apprehension, sensing revelations that might reshape his understanding of not just his legal circumstances, but his personal history as well. What connection? He asked, his deep voice roughened by emotion he couldn't entirely suppress. Abigail met his gaze directly, compassion tempering her natural forthrightness. Dr. Harrington confirms that Edwin Thornton was attempting to provide financial compensation to your family, Mason. Compensation for an accident at a Colorado logging camp in 1869 that resulted in your father's death. The words hit Mason with physical force, memories surging from the carefully sealed compartments where he'd contained his childhood grief. His father's departure for winter work in Colorado. The company representative arriving months later with personal effects and terse explanation. His mother's collapsed expression as their lives shattered beyond repair. Thornton. The name emerged as barely more than whisper. Edwin Thornton was responsible for my father's death. It appears he was supervising the operation where the accident occurred. Abigail's voice remained gentle despite the harsh truth she conveyed. According to Dr. Harrington, Edwin felt deep responsibility for safety procedures that failed that day. He established a trust through Harrington to provide for your family, but efforts to locate you and your mother were unsuccessful until recently. Mason struggled to process this revelation, its implications spiraling outward to encompass not just his past but his present circumstances, his seemingly random arrival at Thornton Ranch, his growing connection to Edwin's widow, the intertwined fates that had brought him to this moment of reckoning. The money, he said, finally pieces connecting in his mind. The payments my mother never received. If they had reached us, she might have had medical care when she fell ill. Abigail completed the thought, understanding evident in her eyes. You might never have been forced into the desperate act that led to these charges. The tragic irony of his situation struck Mason with brutal clarity. His 8 years of running, of isolation, of denied opportunities, all stemming from circumstances that might have been entirely different had Edwin Thornton's attempted restitution actually reached its intended recipients. Daniel Clayton, who had been following this exchange with growing comprehension, turned to Ramsey with newfound authority in his bearing. Given these revelations, I believe transport to Kansas would be premature. This situation clearly requires careful legal review before any further action is taken. The warrant, Ramsey began, but Daniel cut him off with uncharacteristic sharpness. is subject to judicial reconsideration in light of new evidence that significantly alters the context of Mr. Reed's actions and the appropriate response to them. The sheriff's professional judgment had clearly overridden whatever personal reservations he might have harbored regarding Mason. I'll telegraph the territorial judge for guidance, but until such guidance is received, Mr. Reed will remain here under my jurisdiction. Ramsey's face darkened with frustrated anger. You're denying my lawful authority based on a convenient telegram that arrived at precisely the right moment? Seems mighty suspicious timing, Sheriff. I'm exercising appropriate discretion based on credible new information. Daniel's response carried the weight of 20 years law enforcement experience. Information that will be verified through official channels before any final determinations are made. The confrontation between the two men escalated in intensity, their different approaches to justice crystallizing into direct opposition. Mason watched with the detached clarity of someone whose fate was being decided by forces beyond his immediate control, his mind still reeling from revelations about his father's death and Edwin Thornton's role in its aftermath. Through this emotional turbulence, his awareness of Abigail remained acute, her steady presence anchoring the chaotic scene, her clear gaze periodically meeting his with unspoken support. Whatever happened next, her willingness to advocate for his fair treatment, to pursue truth, rather than accept convenient assumptions, had already transformed his circumstances in ways he hadn't dared hope possible. The argument between Daniel and Ramsey showed no signs of resolution when yet another interruption altered the dynamic. Anna appeared at the study door, her expression conveying both apology for the intrusion and urgency that overrode social niceties. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Thornton, but there's a gentleman just arrived asking specifically for Mr. Reed, says it's a matter of considerable importance. Before Abigail could respond, an elderly man appeared behind Anna in the doorway, tall and distinguished despite his advanced years, with intelligent eyes that swept the room's occupants before settling on Mason with evident recognition. Mr. Reed, the newcomer stepped forward, extending a hand that bore the subtle calluses of a medical practitioner. Dr. James Harrington, I believe my telegram has preceded me, but I felt this situation warranted personal attention rather than correspondence alone. Mason stared at the man whose clinic he had broken into 8 years earlier, whose injury had set in motion his years of running. The face was older than he remembered from that desperate night, lined with experience and what appeared to be genuine concern rather than resentment or accusation. Dr. Harrington. Mason accepted the offered hand automatically, still processing the physician's unexpected appearance. I don't understand. You came all this way to correct an injustice that has persisted far too long. Harrington's firm handshake conveyed sincerity that matched his direct gaze. And to fulfill a promise made to Edwin Thornton before his death, to ensure his restitution finally reached its intended recipients. The mention of Edwin further complicated Mason's already turbulent emotions. He glanced at Abigail, finding her expression as surprised as his own by this development. Whatever she had expected from her inquiries, the doctor's personal appearance clearly hadn't been anticipated. I believe introductions are in order. Harrington continued, turning to Abigail with a slight bow that spoke of Eastern upbringing. You must be Mrs. Thornton. Your letter reached my office only yesterday, but fortune had already placed me in Helena on medical business. When your inquiry was forwarded, I recognized its urgency and made arrangements to travel here immediately. You're most welcome, Doctor Harrington. Abigail replied, recovering her composure with characteristic grace. Though I confess your arrival is unexpected, as is the convergence of circumstances I find here. Harrington surveyed the room again, his gaze lingering on Ramsey with evident disapproval before addressing Daniel directly. Sheriff, I assume from context that you're here regarding the outstanding warrant against Mr. Reed. Daniel nodded professional, despite his evident surprise at this new development. That's correct, Doctor. Your telegram has already raised significant questions about the continued validity of those charges. As intended, Harrington reached into his coat, withdrawing an envelope bearing official seals, which is why I took the liberty of consulting with Judge Hayes and Helena before departing. He has issued this order formally dismissing all charges against Mason Reed, effective immediately. The pronouncement fell into the charged atmosphere like a stone breaking still water ripples of consequence, expanding outward to touch everyone present. Mason felt momentarily unmoored, the possibility of freedom after 8 years of vigilant caution, too sudden, too complete, to immediately comprehend. Ramsey's reaction was more visceral, his face flushing with thwarted rage. This is irregular, highly irregular. Hayes has no jurisdiction over Kansas territorial matters. On the contrary, Harrington's calm certainty carried authority born of knowledge rather than aggression. As federal circuit judge, his authority extends to interstate matters precisely like this one, particularly when the alleged victim, myself, has formally withdrawn all accusations and requested dismissal of charges. He extended the document to Daniel, who examined it with appropriate professional scrutiny before looking up with reluctant confirmation. The order appears legitimate and properly executed, Ramsey. Judge Hayes is indeed authorized to make such determinations in cross-territorial cases. This is horse shit. Ramsey's hand moved toward his weapon tension, radiating from his rigid posture. 8 years tracking this man, and suddenly everything's forgiven because some doctor changes his mind. Something's not right here. The only thing not right was the prosecution proceeding against my explicit wishes 8 years ago. Harrington's voice hardened with conviction. A fact I've been attempting to correct through proper channels ever since, only to encounter mysterious delays in misdirected communications, circumstances I now suspect were not entirely accidental. His pointed gaze at Ramsey suggested suspicions that extended beyond mere bureaucratic inefficiency. Mason, observing the exchange while still processing his apparent freedom, recalled Ramsey's personal vindictiveness during their previous encounter, a motivation that might extend to deliberate interference with official correspondence that could have cleared his name years earlier. Daniel Clayton, ever the professional lawman, moved to diffuse the escalating tension. The documentation appears in order, Ramsey. Whatever your personal feelings, Judge Hayes' ruling supersedes the Kansas warrant. Mr. Reed is no longer subject to arrest or extradition. For a moment, Ramsey seemed poised to reject this legal reality through sheer force of will, or more concerning, through the weapon his fingers still hovered near. The room held its collective breath, aware that wounded pride and thwarted purpose could trigger dangerous irrationality, even in a man ostensibly dedicated to legal process. It was Frank Hudson who broke the impasse, his weathered hand resting casually on the shotgun he'd positioned near the study door during the confrontation. Sheriff's made his determination, Mr. Might be time for you to consider your next assignment. The implied threat, delivered with Frank's characteristic understatement, penetrated Ramsey's anger enough to restore calculation to his expression. His gaze swept the room, assessing odds that had shifted decisively against him: Daniel's official authority, Frank's armed presence, even Abigail's quiet determination, presenting a united front he couldn't reasonably overcome. This isn't finished. The bounty hunter directed his parting shot at Mason, venom undisguised in his tone. Judge's order or not, men like you don't change. You'll trip up eventually, and I'll be waiting. That's enough, Ramsey. Daniel's authoritative command left no room for further threats. You've been officially notified that your warrant is no longer valid. Any further pursuit of Mr. Reed would constitute harassment, possibly kidnapping, crimes I would personally ensure were prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The sheriff's unequivocal support from a man who had initially viewed Mason with evident suspicion carried weight that even Ramsey couldn't entirely dismiss. With a final venomous glare, the bounty hunter stalked from the study, his departing footsteps heavy with frustrated rage. In the silence that followed, Mason found himself struggling to fully comprehend the transformation in his circumstances. 8 years of vigilance, of limited connections, of constant readiness to abandon whatever temporary security he'd established, ended in the space of minutes by Dr. Harrington's unexpected intervention. I don't understand, he said, finally turning to the physician whose injury had altered the course of his life. Why now? After all this time, Harrington's expression softened with regret that appeared genuine rather than performed. I've been trying to correct the situation since the day after you fled, Mr. Reed. When I learned the circumstances that drove you to such desperate measures, your mother's illness, your limited resources despite working multiple jobs to support her, I withdrew my initial complaint immediately. But the charges continued. Mason's statement held no accusation, merely confusion about the disconnect between Harrington's claimed intentions and his actual experience. They did, despite my objections. The doctor's frustration remained evident despite the passage of years. The prosecutor was my brother-in-law's protege, eager to establish a reputation for tough justice regardless of victim wishes. He pursued the case independently, and Kansas territorial law permitted such action in felony matters. Mason nodded slowly, the explanation aligning with his understanding of legal procedures that often prioritize technical violation over contextual circumstances. And after I left Kansas, I attempted to locate you through official channels to inform you that I personally had no interest in your prosecution. Harrington glanced toward the departed Ramsey's exit path. But whenever progress seemed imminent, communications would go astray or procedural complications would arise. It wasn't until Mrs. Thornton's inquiry arrived that I realized you might be here within reach of direct intervention rather than bureaucratic processes. The doctor turned to Abigail, respect evident in his formal nod of acknowledgement. Your letter mentioned Edwin Thornton's journals and payments to my office. That connection allowed me to finally fulfill another long-delayed obligation delivery of the funds Edwin entrusted to me for the Reed family after the logging accident. This return to the revelation about his father's death redirected Mason's emotional turbulence. He looked to Abigail, whose composed expression couldn't entirely mask her own complex response to these intersecting personal histories. Edwin never told me about the accident, she said quietly. I discovered the journal entries only recently after learning of the bank debt that threatened the ranch. That doesn't surprise me. Harrington's tone suggested intimate familiarity with Edwin Thornton's character. Edwin carried the guilt of that day, heavily, rarely speaking of it, even to those closest to him. The trust fund he established through my office was his attempt at atonement, though he knew money could never truly compensate for a life lost through negligent safety practices. The clinical assessment of his father's death, negligent safety practices, struck Mason with renewed grief images from childhood surging forward of the strong, principled man who had taught him woodworking horsemanship, the importance of creating beauty alongside utility. A life reduced to corporate terminology and financial calculation. What exactly happened? He asked the question directed at Harrington, but his gaze returning to Abigail, the innocent inheritor of circumstances set in motion long before her arrival at Thornton Ranch. How was Edwin involved in my father's death? Dr. Harrington hesitated, glancing at Abigail as if seeking permission to reveal painful truths about her late husband. At her resolute nod, he continued with careful precision. Edwin was supervising timber operations for the railroad expansion in Colorado. Your father, as I understand it, was an experienced logger hired for winter work while you and your mother remained in Kansas. The doctor's clinical detachment softened with evident sympathy. According to Edwin's account, cost-cutting measures had reduced safety protocols, particularly regarding equipment maintenance. A cable snapped during a critical lift, causing a massive log to shift unexpectedly. Mason closed his eyes briefly, the sterile description nonetheless conjuring vivid images of violence and suffering. He was crushed. Yes. Harrington's confirmation carried genuine regret. Edwin was present, witnessed the accident directly. It affected him profoundly. He resigned his position with the railroad immediately afterward, returning to his family ranch here, determined to operate with different principles. The revelation created unexpected complexity in Mason's emotional response. The Edwin Thornton of Harrington's description, haunted by witnessed tragedy, attempting restitution, reshaping his life around more ethical principles, contradicted the simplistic villain Mason had begun constructing in his mind upon learning of the connection. Abigail seemed to recognize this internal conflict, her perceptive gaze steady as she addressed him directly. Mason, whatever Edwin's role in that tragedy, his failure was compounded by ineffective attempts at remedy. The trust fund he established never reached you or your mother when it might have prevented your desperate circumstances. That failure, whether through incompetence or mismanagement, led directly to your mother's death and your subsequent legal troubles. Her unflinching acknowledgement of her late husband's responsibility, without excuse or defensiveness, struck Mason deeply. There was no attempt to shield Edwin's memory or reputation, only clear-eyed assessment of interconnected consequences that had shaped all their lives. The money doesn't matter now, he said after a moment's consideration. It can't bring back either of our parents. Perhaps not. Dr. Harrington reached into his coat again, withdrawing a legal document embossed with banking seals. But justice, however delayed, still holds value. Edwin Thornton's trust fund for the Reed family has been maintained in your absence, accruing interest for 8 years, while attempts to locate you continued. The current sum is substantial, approximately $5,000. The figure stunned Mason into momentary silence. $5,000, precisely the amount Abigail had mentioned as Edwin's debt to the bank, the financial burden threatening Thornton Ranch's survival. The coincidence seemed too precise to be accidental, the intersection of past and present too perfectly aligned. Daniel Clayton, who had remained present throughout these revelations, voiced the connection Mason was still processing. $5,000, the exact amount of Edwin's railroad investment debt. Yes, Abigail's simple confirmation carried complex implications. Recognition of past injuries and present opportunities, acknowledgement of responsibility without assigning blame. It seems our fates have been intertwined for longer than either of us realized, Mason. The use of his given name, Rare, in their usual careful interactions emphasized the personal nature of this confluence. Mason looked at her, this remarkable woman who had faced adversity with such dignity, who had extended trust where others would have withdrawn it, who now stood at the intersection of their shared history with clear-eyed acceptance of its painful complexities. What happens now, he asked the question, encompassing far more than immediate financial calculations or legal determinations. Abigail held his gaze steadily, her response measured, yet carrying undercurrents that suggested deeper consideration than mere practical resolution. That depends on choices we make moving forward, rather than circumstances forced upon us by the past. The subtle emphasis on we contained possibilities Mason hardly dared examine, directly implications of shared futures, of decisions made in tandem rather than isolation. After 8 years of solitary existence, the prospect of choices made alongside someone who understood both his history and his character created hope so fragile he feared acknowledging it might cause its dissolution. Dr. Harrington, observing this exchange with the perceptiveness of long medical practice, cleared his throat gently. Perhaps Sheriff Clayton and I might step outside to discuss procedural matters regarding the formal dismissal of charges. These financial considerations seem best addressed by the directly affected parties. Daniel hesitated, his professional role temporarily at odds with personal concerns that remained evident despite his efforts at detachment. Then, with visible resolution of internal conflict, he nodded agreement. Of course, Doctor. We should ensure all documentation is properly processed to prevent any future complications for Mr. Reed. He turned toward the door, pausing briefly to address Abigail. I'll return tomorrow to complete any necessary paperwork, if that's convenient. Thank you, Daniel. Her response carried genuine appreciation for his professional handling of a situation fraught with personal complications. For everything. The acknowledgement seemed to provide closure to unspoken tensions, allowing Daniel to depart with dignity intact despite the subtle shift in relationships his intervention had witnessed. As he and Harrington left the study, Frank Hudson followed with characteristic discretion, closing the door to provide privacy for the conversation that both Mason and Abigail recognized must now unfold. Alone together, they regarded each other across the space that separated them. Physical distance, minimal but emotional terrain complex, with histories neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. Mason waited, allowing Abigail to determine the direction their discussion would take, respecting her position both as Thornton Ranch's owner and as the person most affected by revelations about her late husband's actions. $5,000, she said, finally moving to stand beside the window that overlooked the ranch yard. The exact amount needed to clear Edwin's debt and secure Thornton Ranch's future. The timing seems significant. Mason offered, carefully uncertain whether she would view this convergence as opportunity or uncomfortable obligation. More than significant. Abigail turned to face him directly, her blue eyes clear with characteristic forthrightness. It feels like completion of a circle begun long before either of us understood our connection. Edwin's debt to your family becoming the means of preserving what he built here. The philosophical framing surprised Mason, though perhaps it shouldn't have given the thoughtful intelligence he'd observed in their previous conversations. Abigail Thornton was not a woman who viewed life's complexities through simplistic lenses of coincidence or superstition, but neither did she dismiss meaningful patterns when they emerged. The money is yours by right, he said, wanting to establish this fundamental truth before any other considerations entered their discussion. Whatever decisions you make regarding its use at that point isn't negotiable. A smile touched her lips briefly, appreciation for his characteristic directness, even in circumstances where others might employ strategic ambiguity. The legal ownership isn't in question, Mason, but proper use of resources involves more than technical entitlement. She moved away from the window, her steps measured, as she crossed to the desk where Edwin's journal still lay open, its pages revealing connections neither had suspected until recent days. Her fingers traced the handwritten entries briefly before she looked up again, decision evident in her straightened shoulders. I propose a partnership, she said, the words clear and deliberate. Your rightful inheritance applied to clearing the bank debt, securing Thornton Ranch's immediate future. In exchange, equal ownership share in the ranch operations moving forward, full legal partnership in name, as well as practical contribution. The offer stunned Mason with its scope and implications. Equal ownership in a successful cattle operation represented security and stability beyond anything he'd allowed himself to imagine during 8 years of transient existence. It was a business proposition that made practical sense, given his demonstrable skills and the ranch's needs, yet carried personal significance that transcended mere financial calculations. That's extraordinarily generous, he managed, finally processing the proposal's multiple dimensions. But you've built this operation through years of hard work. To share ownership based on funds that are mined by circumstance rather than effort. You misunderstand. Abigail's interruption was gentle but firm. This isn't generosity or charity, Mason. It's recognition of value already demonstrated: your work with Midnight Emperor that secured the breeding contract, your carpentry skills that have improved ranch facilities, your natural leadership that's earned respect from every hand on the property. She moved closer, her direct gaze emphasizing the sincerity of her assessment. The financial contribution merely formalizes what your actions have already established, that you're an asset to Thornton Ranch worth investing in for the long term. The professional framing provided safe territory for discussion of what they both recognized contained more personal dimensions neither was quite ready to address directly. Mason considered her proposal with the careful thoroughness that characterized his approach to significant decisions. A full legal partnership would require trust beyond ordinary business arrangements, he observed, especially given the complications of our initial connection. Trust is earned through demonstrated character, not abstract projections. Abigail's response echoed insights they'd shared during earlier conversations. Whatever Edwin's responsibility for past events, your actions since arriving here have consistently shown integrity, diligence, and genuine concern for the ranch's well-being. Those qualities merit trust regardless of historical intersections. The assessment, delivered with characteristic straightforwardness, touched Mason deeply. After years of being defined primarily by his fugitive status, by a single desperate act that had overshadowed all other aspects of his character and capabilities, Abigail's evaluation based on observed behavior rather than past mistakes represented precisely the recognition he'd stopped expecting to receive. I would be honored to accept partnership in Thornton Ranch, he said finally, his deep voice carrying the weight of commitment this decision represented. Though I suggest one modification to your proposal. Abigail raised an eyebrow, curiosity rather than defensiveness in her expression. What modification? The name. Mason offered a slight smile, the first genuine lightness he'd felt since learning of the connection between their families. Since we would be equal partners, moving forward, perhaps Thornton Reed Ranch would better reflect the operation's future while honoring its foundations. The suggestion clearly surprised her, not the concept itself, but the implicit acknowledgement of lasting commitment it represented. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her composed features, a rare glimpse of vulnerability beneath the capable exterior she presented to the world. You are certain about this, Mason? The question encompassed far more than legal partnership, though neither was quite prepared to articulate those additional dimensions directly. Once formalized, such arrangements aren't easily dissolved. It would mean staying, establishing permanent roots here. I've been running for 8 years, he replied simply. I'm ready to stand still, to build something lasting rather than temporary, to invest in a future beyond mere survival. The words hung between them, their significance extending beyond business considerations into territory neither had expected to navigate when they first encountered each other beside Silver Creek. Abigail regarded him thoughtfully, her clear gaze assessing not just his stated commitment, but the unspoken currents beneath it. Then we have an agreement, She extended her hand, the gesture both professionally appropriate and personally significant. Partners in Thornton Reed Ranch effective immediately upon legal formalization. Mason accepted her offered hand, enveloping her smaller fingers in his careful grip. The contact sent a current of connection through him that transcended their business arrangement, a physical acknowledgement of something deeper developing between them, something neither was quite ready to name, but both increasingly recognized. Partners. He agreed, the word carrying layers of meaning beyond its immediate context. As they stood thus connected in Edwin Thornton's study, surrounded by evidence of intertwined histories neither had suspected when their paths first crossed, Mason felt something settle within his chest, the tight coil of vigilance and isolation that had been his constant companion for 8 years, finally beginning to unwind. Whatever the future held for Thornton Reed Ranch and its newly established partners, one certainty had emerged from the day's revelations. Neither of them would face that future alone, carrying solitary burdens in silence. Like Midnight Emperor learning to trust after mistreatment, they had each found in the other a presence that made vulnerability feel like strength rather than weakness. It was a beginning rather than an ending, tentative, perhaps complicated by histories neither had chosen, but both now accepted as integral to their shared present. Yet in that acceptance lay possibility, the promise of connection that transformed past wounds into foundations for understanding rather than barriers to growth. As Mason finally released Abigail's hand, he found himself thinking of his mother's favorite saying about some people being born, knowing exactly who they were meant to be, while others needed to be loved into becoming themselves. Perhaps both he and Abigail fell into that second category, individuals shaped by circumstance and loss, who had constructed identities around survival and responsibility rather than natural inclination or joy. Perhaps in the partnership they were establishing professional for now, but with potential for evolution, neither could deny they might finally discover who they were meant to be all along, beyond the roles and responsibilities that had defined them in isolation. It was a possibility worth building toward, step by careful step, as autumn deepened into winter, and Silver Creek continued its eternal journey toward distant horizons. Neither could yet envision, but both now faced with shared purpose rather than solitary determination. 6 months later, as spring painted the Montana landscape in vibrant renewal, Abigail stood on the porch of the main house, watching Mason work with Midnight Emperor in the training ring. The stallion, once considered unmanageable, now responded to subtle commands, with willing cooperation, pride rather than submission evident in his powerful movements. The transformation mirrored changes across Thornton Reed Ranch during the months since their partnership had been formalized. New breeding contracts had been secured on the strength of Midnight Emperor's successful demonstrations at the territorial fair. Improvements to facilities and operations had increased efficiency without sacrificing the quality standards Abigail had always insisted upon. The hands had adapted to shared leadership with remarkable ease, respecting Mason's practical expertise alongside Abigail's business acumen. But the most significant transformations had occurred in less visible domains, the gradual evolution of their professional partnership into something more personal, more profound. It had begun with extended conversations during evening inspections of the property, continued through shared meals, discussing ranch operations, deepened during quiet moments beside Silver Creek, where they had first discovered their unexpected connection. Abigail had not planned or anticipated this development. After Edwin's death, she had rebuilt her identity around independence and self-sufficiency, had found purpose in preserving what she'd helped create, despite his hidden debts and deceptions. The possibility of emotional entanglement with another man, particularly one whose life intersected so complexly with her own history, had seemed neither desirable nor likely. Yet Mason Reed had quietly dismantled her careful defenses, not through dramatic gestures or persistent pursuit, but through consistent demonstration of qualities she hadn't realized she valued until witnessing them in action. His patience with difficult animals translated to thoughtful consideration in human interactions. His skilled hands created beauty alongside utility in every project he undertook. His quiet strength provided support without imposing limitations, respected her independence, while offering partnership rather than dominance. Most compelling was his fundamental integrity, the consistency between stated principles and actual behavior that Edwin, for all his social charm, had ultimately lacked. Mason was exactly who he appeared to be, without pretense or hidden agendas. his occasional silences reflecting careful consideration rather than calculated concealment. Watching him now, his powerful frame moving with the characteristic grace as he guided Midnight Emperor through increasingly complex maneuvers, Abigail acknowledged what she had been gradually accepting over recent months. She had fallen in love with her business partner. Not the impulsive infatuation of her youth that had led to disappointing marriage, but mature appreciation based on observed character and shared values, the kind of connection that strengthened rather than diminished individual identity. The recognition brought both clarity and uncertainty. Their professional partnership had flourished precisely because both maintained appropriate boundaries despite growing personal regard. Acknowledging deeper feelings risked disrupting the balanced relationship they had established, introducing complications neither had initially sought. Yet maintaining artificial distance when genuine connection had developed seemed equally problematic, a denial of possibility that contradicted the courage both had demonstrated in other aspects of their shared enterprise. As Mason completed the training session guiding Midnight Emperor back toward the stables with quiet words of praise, Abigail made her decision. The spring evening stretched before them with golden opportunity, Silver Creek flowing clear and inviting after winter's icy constraint. Like the land itself emerging from dormancy into new growth, perhaps it was time for long-protected feelings to find expression beyond careful containment. Mason approached the porch, his smile genuine, as he removed his hat in habitual courtesy. Stallion's progress is remarkable. Henderson's representative will be impressed when he visits next week. I have no doubt. Abigail returned his smile, then added with deliberate casualness, I was thinking of riding down to Silver Creek this evening. The sunset promises to be exceptional after today's clear skies. The invitation, though indirect, carried meaning. Mason immediately recognized Silver Creek had become their place, the location of first connection and subsequent significant conversations. His dark eyes held hers for a moment longer than strictly necessary assessment and appreciation equally evident in his gaze. I'd be happy to accompany you, he replied, the simple response acknowledging layers of unspoken communication beneath its surface. After I've settled Midnight Emperor for the night, I'll have Anna pack a light supper. Abigail maintained practical framing for what they both recognized might become a pivotal evening. Meet me at the stables in an hour. Mason nodded, replacing his hat with deliberate movements that did nothing to disguise the anticipation in his expression. An hour it is. As he turned toward the stables, Abigail found herself appreciating more than his impressive physical presence, though that certainly hadn't diminished in its impact over their months of association. What truly captivated her was the man himself, the complex individual who had emerged from behind careful reserve as mutual trust developed between them. Mason Reed had arrived at Thornton Ranch as a drifter with shadowed past and uncertain future. He had become essential to its operation, integral to its identity, and increasingly central to Abigail's personal sense of possibility beyond practical considerations of ranch management and financial security. Whether their evening conversation would explicitly acknowledge these developments remained uncertain. Both had learned caution through difficult experience, had developed habits of restraint that didn't dissolve easily despite growing evidence of mutual regard. But as Abigail turned toward the house to prepare for their ride, she felt optimism she hadn't experienced since youthful dreams had given way to practical necessities and disappointing realities. Second chances were rare in life, opportunities to begin again with wisdom, born of past mistakes, to build connections based on genuine understanding rather than idealized projections or practical convenience. Whatever direction their conversation might take beside Silver Creek this evening, the foundation had been established for something authentic to grow between them, something neither had expected to discover when their paths first crossed, yet both now recognized as potential worth nurturing with the same patient attention Mason had shown Midnight Emperor. Spring had returned to Montana after winter's dormancy. Perhaps new beginnings were equally possible for hearts that had weathered their own seasons of isolation and careful self-protection. Perhaps, like the land itself emerging into renewed possibility, they too might discover unexpected flowering after extended dormancy. The thought accompanied Abigail as she prepared for evening's possibilities, carrying hope she had long since abandoned during years of practical endurance and solitary determination. Second chances, it seemed, could arrive in unexpected forms through unlikely intersections of past and present, creating futures Neither could have envisioned when traveling separate paths that had against all probability converged beside Silver Creek's flowing waters.